Wait, I have a sticky note I wrote myself. Hold on.
Recording in progress.
Good evening and welcome to the June 4th, 2025 Yarmouth Planning Board meeting. I am Joanne Crowley, Chair. The public is welcome to attend our meetings in person or via alternative public access provided on the Town of Yarmouth website. Our meetings are generally held on the first and third Wednesdays of the month, but additional meetings are added when needed. I'll begin by taking roll call. Susan Britta. Present. Deirdre Gaquin. Will Rubenstein.
Here.
Remote.
Oh,
Deirdre's remote.
Oh, Deirdre.
I don't know.
Here,
Hey,
on
you.
remote.
Thank you.
I am here, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Okay.
Jim Saban. Peter Slovak. Ken Smith.
Here.
Joanne Crowley, present. Seeing that we have a quorum, I'll now call the meeting to order, and I would ask that you join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
Under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This evening, we are on our agenda. A pair of our consultants are joining us. Welcome, Jeff and Jeremy. We're going to review the status of some consulting work that they have been doing for us on mixed-use studies. Jeff from the BCS Group will be going over the Route 28 regulatory review analysis, and Jeremy from Union Studios has prepared a series of case studies and illustrative sites of 1, 2, and 3 acres and the possible development of them. We'll also talk about, at some point, I think we should review schedule and timeline, Kath. And then I think we should just cover a quick update on the LCP at the end. So I'd like to turn it over to Jeff. Welcome, Jeff. Jeff Bagg.
Hi, everybody. Good evening, and I'm joined by Adam DeShano in our office as well, so he'll be backing me up on our presentation today.
Welcome, Adam.
And then, Kathy, can you just remind me, do you want me to share my screen at all?
No,
or were you going to do that in the
I have
room?
the slides shown up, and hopefully Gabriel can start showing the slide screen, and then you'll be able to see it as well, and you can tell me when you want to move along in the
Okay.
slides. This way everyone in the room, as well as at home, can see it easily.
Yep, perfect. So on the cover slide, I did want to just acknowledge that the project is funded by a community planning grant by the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. And that, we're sort of in our sort of task 2 of our project. Well, the first one was the benchmarking, where we went through some projects throughout Massachusetts and some on the Cape to kind of show some successful projects that were built, mixed-use projects. And then this second phase of our task is a regulatory analysis. And I think with that, we can go to the first slide as the introduction. My my presentation is a lot of words, a lot of important words, and I know Union Studios has a lot of nice graphics to help illustrate some of the stuff. So just bear with me. What I tried to do with our slides tonight is really parallel the written report. We provided the draft to the planning board, and so it should be in a packet. And we anticipate this being a document that will exist and be a reference for the town moving forward. So the slides are a summation of that, and I tried to stick pretty close to the text that was included in the packet. But what the first and foremost thing is coming out of the local comprehensive plan process, which is well underway. Really, the town has identified a preference for the Route 28 corridor to be a focal point for encouraging redevelopment, especially of underutilized property and new development where it's feasible. And mixed use has really been a very long established goal of the town, and it's a really clear theme coming through the LCP, including the growth policy, which is part of that. And kind of secondary to the community engagement process, really looking ahead and seeing the ongoing sewer installation project is a really big public infrastructure project that's been planned for a long time, but it's coming to fruition now, as well as two pretty large Mass DOT projects, which are pedestrian safety and roadway improvements, a long stretch of the Route 28 corridor, and then over by the Bass River Bridge. And all three of these public infrastructure projects are kind of queued up to take place over the next, let's say, three years or so. And this is a great time to be examining the zoning to make sure it's kind of the projects that you want to get are encouraged through the zoning. So our report, one of the things it does is it does an inventory of recently approved projects along Route 28 corridor, and that was something that when we scoped the project, we felt that we could just look at the zoning text, but by looking at the projects that have been permitted under the zoning, we can actually ground truth some of the zoning to see what's working and potentially what's not working, and that's a really good way to investigate, what to do with the zoning, if anything, moving forward. And then just acknowledging that Union Studios is doing a different element of this same project, providing assessments and illustrations for potential mixed use options on properties with a size range between 1, 2, and 3 acres to really help understand the design options and constraints. And I'm sure as Jeremy presents a little bit later, he'll dig in deeper. And I think Adam and I are going to stay on to listen to that to see how some of the Union Studios findings, we can still tailor some of our findings, or at least see how close we are with finding some of the issues and problems that might exist. So with that, you can go to the next slide. Just trying to acknowledge that since the 1990s, this has really been a concerted effort of the town to really achieve the character and functionality that people sort of expect and want to see on Route 28. And there really has been a lot of success, and I don't want to underplay the amount of success that the town has and the amount of effort that has been put in. And just quickly, it's mirroring one of our sections in the local comprehensive plan, but there's really three really important zoning districts that have been created, overlay districts, and then a regulatory structure with the growth incentive zone. But the road was adopted in 1999, and that gave some flexibility and allows waivers from the base zoning requirements. And we're seeing a trend that's been very helpful to let projects move forward where there might be a constraint in the zoning. The hotel motel overlay district, the HMOD1, the one in particular, the District 1 applies to Route 28, adopted in 2006. And really creates a carefully controlled mechanism to promote the redevelopment of hotel and motel properties, some of which, over time have fallen into disrepair, and really this desire to allow them to be renovated and enhanced into housing opportunities. So, and then the last big zoning, effort was really this Village Centers Overlay District, the VCOD, so that was in 2012. I mean, really clearly a significant effort on behalf of the town to set this up, really creating incentives for new development activity based on specific standards that kind of matched the areas along Route 28. And so there's 4 distinct districts that were intended to kind of, enhance what was already there, the positive characteristics. And then the last item, just to these items worth mentioning, is the growth incentive zone. It's not zoning, but it's a regulatory tool. So it was originally created in 2007, and updated in 2021, extended, and this is in place until 2035, I believe. The tool eases some of the requirements of the Cape Cod Commission, so this alleviates the requirement for certain projects to become reviewed as a development of regional impact, and that has been successful in certain cases along Route 28. Just quickly, a zoning map. We digitized the zoning map and we applied the underlying zoning, this B2 area. We added the road overlay district, which applies to certain motel and hotel properties along the corridor. The Aquifer Protection District and the Village Center overlays with the inset shows you the 4 distinct areas. And this will come up again as we mapped some of the projects that have been permitted. And this helps orient, people to projects and the zoning. So it's just a copy of the zoning map. And then part of our project is intensive look at permitted projects, and I have an asterisk that I added. This wasn't necessarily in the report, but I just wanted to have a disclaimer that this is not necessarily a comprehensive list of every project on Route 28. We worked with Kathy to get a really great list, but I just wanted to be careful to be clear that this is not every project, and certainly not some of the smaller ones that might have changed use in a building. We didn't look at those in detail. We looked at the larger projects that were either big renovations or new construction. But we did look at 21 projects. We created a spreadsheet, which is in the package of material. I promise I will not show the spreadsheet. We will not glaze over looking at a spreadsheet of this. But what we did capture was these really important components of each project. So address, approval date, the zoning district, and permit type. Just basic information to catalog the projects that we looked at. And then an important part about the status is there are projects that were approved, so permitted and built, and those are depicted on the map. But then there are projects that were approved and not built. And talking to Kathy, and as we finalize our report, we are going to make a finer point to distinguish between projects that were recently permitted and not built, as a way to identify that those projects have, they probably still have legs and they might still move forward, versus a project that was permitted, 2019 or so, and it's unclear, if it will move forward. So we're going to do a little bit more fine tuning on that. Looking at the use, we broke them down to general categories: residential, commercial, mixed use, and we did put in a couple of municipal projects. We felt that those were important for the character of the corridor, and then some characteristics of each project. So the goal is really to better understand the types of development that have been approved to determine if the zoning is providing what is desired. And we're estimating right now that 10 of the 21 projects were permitted and built. Several have been recently permitted and are anticipated to be constructed. And so on the next page, we're going to shift to a map, which helps visualize this. For quick orientation, the map is it's the east-west corridor. So the west side of Route 28 is the left side of the map, and we arranged our data so that the data in the spreadsheet starts on the west side and runs through to the east. So just for easy reference, the first project listed is 55 Route 28, so Becker's Package Store. That's listed on the left side, and it's the first project listed in the spreadsheet. So we tried to color code these the best we could, where blue is residential, and these are all residential projects, like a project that has all residential units in it. All commercial is in the sort of the maroon, the darker red, and then mixed use is projects in orange. And then we did include municipal parks. Those are green, and on the left side, on the west side, is the Baxter Grist Mill. The next project in green is the Chase Brook Park, which is approved and in design, and then Parker's River Landing in the center there. And we talked about this, that it doesn't necessarily relate to zoning per se, but it does relate to the character of Route 28, and it starts to fulfill some of the visions that the town has had to create these active areas along the corridor. And then you can see the village center overlay districts are color coded. They're kind of on the right side of the page. And we took time to do this. This is something that came up, early on in the local comprehensive plan process, was kind of this discussion about, it would be great to help illustrate to people the number of projects and the potential investment that is happening along Route 28. I think people do fall victim to not seeing much, in the way of actual construction, even though there's a lot of this permitted activity in the wings, that has previously permitted a whole bunch of projects. So we can dive into this a little bit more. Again, I think my takeaway here is that it corresponds to the spreadsheet, which has a lot of the more detailed information that some people would want. the last thing, I guess, sorry, is in the legend you can see a green circle with a green check mark. We did try to capture projects that have been built. And so those are signified by the green check mark. And so it takes a little time to get accustomed to this map, but it is in your packet.
Jeff, can we just take a minute
yes.
to go through a quick look at this?
Sure. Yep. And I do have, as a preview, just one thing, Joanne. On the next slide, the one thing that was not in the packet that we were able to at least start to put together is a list of which projects fell into which category. So I don't know if this is helpful, but this is mixed use projects on the left, and I tried to break this down. So green is built, and then there's the permitted projects. And then I'm just trying to figure out, we're trying to figure out the way to illustrate this for recently approved and some projects that are early stages. And then when you look at the residential column, there's more projects that have actually been built, but we still have in that middle column some recently approved and early stages. And then just lastly on the right is the commercial projects. So 2 of the 3 have been built and 1 is recently approved. So we're just trying to break this down a little bit for people to be able to see this quicker.
That's helpful, because I wanted to ask, and I see that you've answered it with this slide, kind of the time frame that you looked at these. I don't have an objection to including Captain Gladcliffe, but it was a very long time ago. And most of the others are more recent. But the one I see that's missing is the hotel,
What hotel?
the suites.
Hampton Inn?
Yeah. Wasn't that an HMO? I mean, I wasn't here for that, but was that an HMOD? I thought it was.
I think it might have been.
I think
it
it was.
might have been.
And that's-
When was
that's
that done?
big.
In 2011?
Yeah, so if Captain Gladcliffe is in there, I think that hotel is really nice. I mean, it's kind of the gateway in, and it's national. So I'd like to see if we could throw that on the map.
I think the reason I included the Captain Gladcliffe apartments was because I know that Peter Slovak had been commenting about how motels have been converted to residential,
Yeah.
and that was one of those that had
Yeah.
happened. Hampton Inn was motel to hotel, definitely nicer. But yeah, I can certainly provide that information to Jeff.
And the other comment I had, just generally in the narrative, not for the presentation necessarily, but you do identify the open space, the 3 open space projects. But we don't say open space anywhere in the narrative. We talk about commercial, we talk about mixed use, we talk about residential. So as you move into the narrative, it can just be a sentence. It can be something very simple. I think we need to work in language that talks about the open space projects as well.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I appreciate that feedback. I think the other thing is, my understanding is town meeting funded something recently for a town common, and so
Yeah.
that might be a way, because I think that the town common example is another one where that was identified as a goal, long ago, and it could be implemented. So we'll take a look at open space and kind of putting that in the narrative, and then maybe even adding the town common park project. With some specific details about where that is and what that might look like moving forward.
I think that would be a good idea because it has been approved by town meeting, so.
Correct.
Anybody
Great.
else
So-
have any questions on the map?
Should we add the second park on Route 28? You've got Chase Brook, but there's a second one. Remember the other,
They actually renamed all those 3 parks to just be Chase
there's
Brook
going to be
Park.
one, okay. So and this captures all three of those sites?
Well, this is basically their existing parks. This was actually taking a motel, removing it, and
Right.
turning it into a park. Yes, we're going to combine it and upgrade and have a nice waterfront park,
Okay.
but it's kind of emphasizing what we did with the 275.
Okay,
The only other thing is, while we're talking about them, is I know that Peter Slovak had mentioned the laundromat project at 897.
That's what I wanted to know.
yeah.
Right. I couldn't remember, because I couldn't remember if 811 was those, because that was also 8 apartments, if I recall, or is that 12?
I think it was 8.
Right. So I'm glad so there should be one more, because that was just approved.
Well, it
Still
wasn't
inapproved.
approved locally for anything. It would be something that, in my opinion, would be early stages of design. They went through and got a letter from the state for a Chapter 40B project. But my understanding is they're not going to be using that letter. They're going to be coming back with a different 40B project. But I can provide, and I'm not exactly sure what that all involves, but we can include that. It's going to be, it's in our local permitting phase, but we haven't seen anything. I mean, I'm assuming they're designing something right now. It's in the design
Is this
stages for them.
Is this not the one that you and Madam Chair talked to about the fire trucks?
That's a different one.
That's 811, the residences, that's in there.
So I just,
It is
sorry,
811,
my head
yeah.
was a little, I don't think necessarily in addresses, especially
sorry,
when it
that's
comes
all
to
I
Route
think
28.
of.
I know. Well, everybody's brain works differently. So I appreciate you talking that through, and I apologize if there was any confusion about the other project, which I agree should be captured.
Yeah, so
you.
the laundromat, the town commons, and then the Hampton Inn.
Okay.
Yeah, this is great feedback. And so just to clarify, do you think the 2009 project, the Gladcliff Apartments should stay? Or does that sort of get marked off as too long ago?
I believe that it should stay if we're gonna add the Hampton Inn, because that wasn't much after that.
Agreed.
So,
Okay. Yep. Yeah, because I think within reason, I think we have some flexibility left to incorporate another project if there's something else that comes to mind and kind of Kathy thinks that it fits in to our scheme here. We can absorb that. So I think that makes sense. Just going back to the slide that's the breakdown. It's all the projects with a little bit of color coding. It's just after the map there. Thank you, that one.
Yep.
This is a bit of a work in progress, but I think, as we go into some of the issues, constraints, and barriers, I think it doesn't, this slide by itself doesn't tell the whole story, but it tells a little bit of a story, which is that for whatever reason, and that's what we're trying to drill down on, there's been more residential projects that have been permitted and built. And I think through the work that we're going to finish up with this project and the work that Union Studios is looking at doing, I think we want to make sure that we're really trying to figure out if there's something with some of these permitted projects that don't move forward into construction, if we can start to identify what some of the constraints might be that's preventing them. In some cases, we'll never know, but in some cases, it could be X, Y, or Z. And I think through some of the slides that we're going to go through next, we start to uncover some possibilities, but also a little bit of looking back at maybe why some of the projects haven't moved, but also a big emphasis on looking ahead, over the next 3 or 4 years. Are there things that can still be done to make it even easier or clearer for projects to move forward? And so that's kind of the gist of where I'm about to go with the next slide, which is starting off with some issues, constraints, and barriers. And one thing I did want to say, this is
Jeff,
just a look.
if I could interrupt you,
Yeah.
can you
Please.
not share your slide? I'd like to be able to see you.
I don't know whether that's
can do
something
that?
that Gabriel's doing.
All of a
Okay,
sudden,
yeah.
he switched.
I
We
am
need
not
to
sharing any slides.
Yeah, we need to show this so that people can see it at home.
Well-
I don't know whether we can see Jeff's face here in the room and see this,
No, but we've been seeing him. I guess that's my,
and I don't know whether the slides have been available
Oh.
at home.
I can display it, but people on Zoom won't see the slides as well.
oh, never mind then. Okay.
We want to see the slides.
One quick question. Can you click on the OK button, please, so we can see some faces while they're talking, and
top
there's a
of this-
slide below it? See the blue OK button?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, thanks.
We just want to see Jeff's face while he's
Couldn't have walked
talking.
up to the screen and tapped it? Yeah, okay. Well, now I feel like a dum-dum. Okay, next time I'll do that all by myself.
Thank you.
thank you.
Believe it or not, everyone's still getting used to all the technology. It's pretty wild. But thank you, I appreciate that. And so, again, my slides, they have a lot of text, and I didn't put every word in the report, but I tried to make sure we were being consistent. I wanted to be mindful of the amount of text, but also the importance of the subject. So, the basis for this, again, is kind of the community input from the LCP. So we got public input, through early on, actually. So in 2021, the survey, that's relevant data for the LCP. We had stakeholder meetings, and then we had the community engagement sessions. And so gleaning from that, we're able to get some directions on Route 28. Also the benchmarking evaluation, the zoning analysis that is part of this, and then the review of permanent projects. And I think, to be inclusive, I think looking at some of the stuff that Union Studios is going to provide, I think all factors in. But I just wanted to kind of identify kind of where the basis of this is coming from. And that we're just looking at the zoning. There's been a lot of success. I know that a lot of people have worked really hard, and so none of this is intended to diminish any of the work or the success that the town has had. It's just a little bit more straight look at, potentially some of the things that are barriers. So multiple permits and or meetings is an important one. It's really there's been a lot done to provide incentives and provide opportunity for projects and properties to redevelop, but sometimes the path to getting the approval involves multiple boards, and it involves some discretionary approval on top of multiple meetings and hearings. And I think, you know, some of the things that we know from talking to developers just globally is that it's a lot of exposure. Every time there's a butters notice that goes out for a public hearing that's happening, you know, those are risks. They create risks and opportunity. Obviously, you know, balancing the need for public input and the value of it, but with you know, the potential to streamline that, and just understanding that can be expensive and nerve-wracking for a developer, and it can be a challenge to projects. So I'll leave that there. We have a little bit of solution discussion, you know, 2 slides more, but one other thing in terms of the high percentage of commercial use that's required, particularly in the road bylaw, you know, in order to be eligible for the flexibility that it offers, you have to have 50% of the gross floor area of a project be commercial. And the trend across the board is that, and it may be directly as a result of COVID, it may be peripherally because of COVID, it's just people's changing patterns. The ability to find tenants and to fill commercial spaces can be challenging, and it seems like it's getting more challenging. So it's a pretty high percentage to achieve 50%. People have done it, and so it's not that it can't be done, but it might be a barrier. And then just conversely with the VCOD, that's lowered down. The expectation for a VCOD project is 15% of the project is commercial. So you have that variability, that gap between 15% and 50%. That can be challenging. I think there's anecdotally there's information about the ability for developers to secure funding because of the uncertainty about the ability to fill tenant space, and so there's a lot of factors underlying that. But we're highlighting it as a potential barrier. The lack of sewer access, quickly noting that the town has put forth a tremendous amount of effort and time and financial investment to get the wastewater project underway. It is happily underway. I think there's so much kudos should be given to the town for pushing that project forward. But I think that there is this time lapse that we probably saw a few years ago. It's probably started a few years ago, where a developer who's really looking to invest in a property knows that a sewer project is coming, but may not be able to, you know, come up with a plan that incorporates septic just to cover that period of time. So there's something here that we're interested to kind of keep following in terms of projects that have been permitted and not built. You know, if they've designed a septic system before they actually go forward with the investment of installing the septic system, you know, they might be waiting or really calculating the investment value of doing the septic system versus waiting till 2028 or later to actually revise the project or move forward with the project. And you know, it's estimated at 2028. You know, I think everyone wants it to move forward earnestly, and it's going to happen. But if the schedule slips, if that becomes 2029, you know, that could be a really impactful thing to a developer who's investing, you know, significantly into one of these projects. So that's just it's so great that project is so far along and moving, but there still is this gap between now and at least 2028 where there's probably uncertainty for developers looking at projects. Limited residential density. I don't mean to say this aggressively, but there is a cap at 16 units per acre on most of the properties. We do talk about 40R at the end of our presentation, and that starts at a minimum of 20 units per acre. And so it's a sensitive subject, but it is worth it might be worth pursuing this as a discussion piece to just find out if there's any wiggle room there, kind of balancing this potential concern with the amount of commercial space with the amount of residential unit availability that might that might be a barrier for some projects to be limited in the number of residential units. Again, we'll talk about that in the solutions section. And then this is kind of a long list, parking requirements. But I think as Union Studios will portray, I think when you're looking at the build out of a site, you go between the amount of building space and the amount of parking, and that oftentimes dictates the build out. And so just really thinking about opportunities for reducing the parking requirements. The zoning does offer shared parking, which is great. It looked like on our first run through of all this that it prohibits the reduction of parking for residential units. So just understanding, looking ahead, if there is any flexibility that might be available, or lowering the threshold. My understanding is if you're talking about 1.25, what does it do to a project to go down to 1? And that helps elaborate on the build-out analysis, but then as Kathy kind of mentioned, it does put the constraint on the amount of parking that's actually required. So just looking at parking, parcel size and assembly, I didn't incorporate it, but I did want to pull up an image, and I'm not prepared to do tonight, but during the 2012 VCOD process, there were some illustrations prepared, and when we looked at that, they really showed these mixed-use villages. The intent was to reduce curb cuts on Route 28, provide these internal access roads that led people to a range of buildings and building sizes and types of uses. It looks to us that a lot of that didn't come to fruition, and we think that it's because of the need to gather all these parcels to really assemble a large group of parcels to make this one project happen. The complexity and timeline to do that is pretty challenging. It's a barrier, not only to time and legal costs, but also just money to secure option agreements on properties or to outright purchase them. There's just a lot there to get to a large parcel to create that village, that real village feel that was kind of shown in some of those illustrations. The next one is confusion and complexity. For the VCOD, it's 2 miles of the 5-ish mile stretch, and there's a base zoning, district, and then there's overlay districts on top of that, and then even within the VCOD, there's 4 of them. So it creates some complexity for a property owner to understand what is viable. And I know that there's a team, and Kathy meets with people constantly, and the planning board is really flexible with entertaining those questions, but it can be challenging on the surface to navigate that. And then in terms of the zoning bylaw itself, many communities have done this, but they've added, the sections get added over time. And there's a lot of references, if you're in the VCOD section, there's a lot of references to other areas of the bylaw. And that's common, but it's challenging to trace those all back sometimes, where they're not all in the same place. And then the use of footnotes also is really common, but it creates a trail, for someone to follow to something that actually has a fair amount of significance to a project is in a footnote. And so there's, a zoning diagnostic, and we'll talk about that in the solutions actually, so that's just the problem there. Waivers, zoning relief, and variances, not universal in any way, but several of the projects needed relief, a special permit, some needed a variance, some got a 40B permit, so some went total comprehensive permit. And I think just as a practice where there's consistently waivers or variation being granted, it really is something to look at, just to really look there and find out if it's too restrictive, if it's unnecessary, or maybe think about moving something to by right to clarify. But we have some discussion of that in the solutions section. So snapping ahead to looking at some preliminary recommendations, we really want to map this out with the town. They're generally arranged from the easiest potentially to the most challenging, and the easiest thing would, not desirable, but easiest would be to do nothing. It was not to be contrite about it. I do think that there's a lot of success and there's a lot of opportunity still with the properties to maneuver through the existing zoning. So if it does stay, it's not an absolute detriment. There has been a lot of great projects, but we did want to put it in there just in case. It whether it's fails at town meeting or doesn't ever move forward, for some reason there's no changes. It's not the end of the world, but our job is to kind of help look at what might make it better. So with some suggestion from Kathy, in our look at it as well, the architectural and site design standards was adopted in 2006, and just collectively we know that a lot has changed since 2006. A lot of design requirements and a lot of expectations, and even the emphasis on mixed use development and the way that they play out on a property have changed. So kind of pushing to either update them or eliminate them and work them through the existing. There's other design standards that the town has, so there's some options here. But I think really looking at them to make sure that if you keep them in place, are they going to provide the types of projects that you want to see on Route 28? And then kind of in the middle here, this is a really important one, we think, because it's critical for the development sort of world, but also can be something that is reasonable to expect to get through town meeting, is consolidating some of the permitting requirements wherever possible, sort of taking away the discretionary approval. So a special permit, with it comes the rights the rights and almost the expectation that a project could be appealed and navigate litigation. If that can be removed or made more, I guess removed, it would make it more predictable, and it doesn't eliminate all ability to be regulated, but it just makes it by right predictable and clearer for a developer to know that they are most likely going to get a permit at the end of the day. And then wherever there's two boards required, so in some cases the zoning board of appeals is the permit granting authority, and the planning board has to issue a permit, and then the developer has secured all its approvals. Any consolidation of the permitting process to one board, in most cases that ends up being the planning board, that is really effective. That's really helpful because it allows the developer to concentrate on that approval process. It gives the planning board the knowledge and the know-how to kind of move through looking at waivers and the history of the purpose of the zoning bylaw and those sorts of things. And so it doesn't take away necessarily permitting, but it streamlines it. And from a developer's perspective, that can be really helpful and impactful, a positive impact. And then looking at the growth incentives zone, the town wants to update it. It's listed as an action item in the LCP, but accelerating that might be helpful just to find out if there's additional projects or additional descriptions or different opportunities that could be worked into the growth incentive zone to continue to incentivize the projects that you want to see. So that's a complicated process. That's why it's kind of in the middle here. And then the last three, require research. I think in terms of reducing the amount of commercial space, we think that there could be some merit here. I would be curious what Union Studios presents, but I think considering that 50% threshold, if that were reduced, it might allow more projects to go through the road process and get the additional waivers or flexibility that they need. So it's just something that we're seeing, given the costs and the potential issues with securing tenants for all that commercial space. This push for housing, the Cape and Massachusetts in general are in this housing crisis, and there's a strong emphasis and a push towards housing, and this might be a way to look at that commercial calculation and maybe lower it and get some more commercial units as a way to push a project forward, project that's on the fence from moving forward to actually happening. Recodification, it's not glamorous, but and it is a longer process, but recodification usually looks at just fixing the way the zoning bylaw reads and looks through the sections and helps all the information be reconsolidated. It doesn't usually make substantive changes, but that would help with the footnotes and the references. It would really consolidate the way that someone gets the zoning bylaw and starts to analyze it. And so that is something that is on the list. And then lastly is just maybe some more aggressive strategies. Those kind of include increasing the residential density. In a second, we'll talk about the 40R and how that threshold to be eligible for certain 40R projects is a minimum of 20 units per acre. And we know that not just in Yarmouth, but in other places. That's a sensitive discussion. Really understanding what that does to the area, if it's viable or palpable. But it is something that, you know, it could be worth exploring, and it's really kind of taking the stones and making sure you're looking under every stone for options. Elimination of the VCOD districts in place of the road is just kind of one example. We looked at the VCODs, and they're very similar. There are some distinct differences. A couple areas have different setbacks. There's some slight variations in the uses that are allowed. But with the exception of some the VCOD 2, I think it is, has this density opportunity where you can go up to 20 units per acre. Other than that, they're fairly similar, and so there's just this notion of maybe simplifying the permitting process could be done by eliminating that. And then the last one is the 40R Smart Growth Overlay District. And so I think with this, I get to my last slide, which is we were tasked with looking at the potential benefits of 40R. The note is that based on our research, our knowledge, that there's no towns on the Cape that have adopted the 40R overlay district. So it's important to mention that. It's common throughout the rest of Massachusetts, but not on Cape. What it is it's a set of regulations that are produced by the state, and they're locally adopted, so it's only by choice, but they really encourage the creation of dense residential and mixed-use areas. And some of the trade-offs are that a denser mixed-use project is required to have 20% of the units be affordable. And then there are some financial incentives that are given to the municipality for undertaking this task, for kind of working towards the effort to provide more housing through 40R. And so a couple of the key elements here are sustainable design. It's really intended to encourage new developments in areas that are already developed. So whether or not it's an ultimate fit or not, Route 28 corridor is a good, at least it meets that already developed kind of characteristic. It does allow for areas that are suitable. So if you have an area that's offset from a developed area, but it's suitable, it's already been disturbed, or it's got activity and it's viable, 40R can be applied in an outlying area. There are some infrastructure requirements that will have to be met to do that. And then there are design standards, and there's a requirement to meet sustainable design principles, and those are laid out. What it does is it increases density by right, so it takes the zoning and consolidates it to, in most cases, it's the planning board, and all permits are granted the permit is granted by the planning board, and any waivers are also administered by the planning board. So it's kind of what we talked about before with the consolidated permitting, and it's by right. And so a lot of the developers have said that the 40R is beneficial because it gives them the clarity to know that once they go through this process, at the end of it, they're going to walk out with an actual permit without the concern of an appeal. And then just the increased density, we think that there's evidence that starts to show that the additional density, the additional dwelling units help projects pencil out at the end of the day, and increase their chances of getting built. Streamlined and predictable permitting, we already talked about that. And then financial incentives is really where, if it's adopted, there's 3 types of financial incentives that are offered, available to the municipality. One is when you map out the area, there's some calculations of the number of units that are above and beyond what's already allowed. So the increase in density is monetized for the municipality as an incentive. A lot of towns use that to leverage infrastructure grants or other infrastructure improvements. Sometimes they're used for design funds. So if you have a big roadway improvement project, that the municipalities typically have to pay for the design, and if you're successful balancing this, the 40R incentive payments could be used to pay for that design work. So it's leveraging some of the public dollars. And then if any housing unit is built once adopted, the town is eligible for a $3,000 per unit payment. So when you get into some of the larger projects, that's helpful. And it can be used for these design projects or other projects. You can do the numbers on $3,000 per unit for a project. It's not significant necessarily for each project, but when you look cumulatively across a long corridor and you start to get projects over time, every time there's a dwelling unit added, that is an incentive payment. And then lastly, there is a process to get funds if a project is identified and tracked as producing school-age children. There's a way to get reimbursement costs for schools. So with that, I am done unless you have questions, and Adam is here in case I missed anything, but I think if we have questions, we can try to tackle them now.
Any questions, you guys?
There's a lot.
A lot to digest.
Although none of it, quite frankly, new. For those of us, I'm sure very few items on here are new. We've been aware of many of these issues for a long, long time. But it is nice to see it all in one.
All in one place.
All in one place.
Yeah. In fact, Kathy and I talked about that today, earlier, that it's great to have a focused look at these things.
And
But we are, you're right, we've been dealing with all of these.
Madam Chair, may I just
Yeah,
say,
Mr.
I mean,
Lucy.
if we've been trying, well, let me back up. We all acknowledge the housing crisis, because that's the word I think that's deserved to be used on the Cape, and how it affects both economic development as well as just community stability and the ability for people to continue to afford to live here and then continue to do things like have schools that have X number of kids versus X minus, in some cases, 10, 20, 30% than they were even 20 years ago, including in our own town. Not to mention with our friends across the river and how their contribution to the overall school population has declined. And that's not a judgment, that's just a fact. So then, there's lots of little ways to try to help the housing crisis, and we all try to contribute on a monthly and even annual basis to stem it. And of course, we spent 18 months on the ADU issue. We never went into it thinking it was going to solve the housing crisis, but we also felt like it was going to help some people do good things so that more people could live on the Cape and could afford to live here. And then our friends at the state of Massachusetts came down from the mountain with the tablets, which we're still working on and we still have to work on. But when I read about 40R, which I think I remember we might have even brushed on it when I first joined the planning board, but it was very minor. The reason I'm bringing this up is because now that the first phase of the sewer system is underway, this is what I was hearing when I first moved here 22 years ago, was that when the sewer system came, that was going to help the town, right? On an environmental level, as well as a commercial level and as a residential level. And so now we're at the place where when you start thinking about recodification or codification, probably more codification since we live here, that this is our opportunity to help contribute to the health and the future of our town, and much less the Cape. So I recognize that sometimes when we see capital A affordable, sometimes people get a little hinky, as one of my high school teachers used to say. But at the same time, we're not in 2004 anymore. The demographics of our town are not 2004. The school population is not 2004. And certainly the housing prices are not 2004. And so I hope that we'll all keep an open mind when these kinds of, all these different strategies, which again, I appreciate Jeff and Adam, congealing into this one document. I just hope we'll all keep an open mind as to what we're trying to do on the micro level to help contribute to the macro level, which is to slow down the departures of lots of good people that we all know of different generations from the Cape, and the incredible impacts that has, whether you're trying to run a business or run a school or be nice people that just live here in their older years. All of us, whatever stage we are affected by these issues. And again, I will stop my soliloquy, but I just hope that we'll continue to keep an open mind and not necessarily fall back into 10 to 20 years ago thinking when that doesn't apply to a current problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. Anyone else?
I just want to add to the second hand to one of the things that Will's talked about. I always think when we talk about affordable housing, we cannot have a good discussion about affordable housing unless we also talk about economic development and job creation. Sometimes people can't afford the house because it is too expensive, but also because they're not making enough money. You know, the Cape really needs, and I'm talking, you know, the entire Cape, not just Yarmouth, the entire Cape. It has to be a regional push to develop better jobs on the Cape so that people can afford the houses and they can stay. You know, I think we have to move beyond this notion that we're a summer economy. And we've recognized that. We always push forward, you know, when development comes, the motel has to do something 12 months out of the year, just kind of, you know, get the indoor pool, get the activities that will get people down here in November and December. And the two need to go hand in hand, because you cannot, I don't think you can effectively solve the housing problem until we get an economic base that can help us in that problem, help us solve that problem. I think it's an integral part, and we just don't have it yet. We're better than we were, but we don't have it yet, and we need to get there. We need to push for economic development, good, solid jobs that allow these people are now leaving, the younger family, to stay here and afford the jobs. They have to go hand in hand. The conversation has to go hand in hand. And we focus on the housing. I think we're doing a good job in the housing, not such a great job on making sure that the economic development conversation is not just housing, it's jobs too.
One comment, and I think I've made this before, you know, we talk about our wonderful wastewater project and how we're so far ahead of others and how well it's going, and our plans are progressing. That doesn't have endless capacity.
Right.
It just doesn't. And that corridor can't be built out to whatever maximum that people think they want. There simply isn't capacity to process the waste. So we need to think about that kind of constraint sitting out there. How much build out can there be without threatening the capacity of the treatment plant, and getting and finding more what's it called when
Effluent discharge.
the good water comes out.
Effluent discharge.
Oh, you mean effluent?
discharge,
The
yeah.
discharge, yeah, effluent discharge.
So I think I've said this before, so I just wanted to.
I would just like to point out that the critical things aren't necessarily the capacity of the plant, because we built in like 750,000 gallons per day of additional new growth. It's the effluent
Yeah.
discharge locations as well as our water supply.
That's right.
Yep. Water's got to go in for it to come out.
The water's gonna come out, Madam Chair, the water's gonna come out of the ground too. And there's only so much water in the ground beneath us.
Exactly
So
right.
that certainly has to be taken into consideration also.
That's a limiting capacity.
Yep.
Yeah.
Kathy, did you have?
I just wanted to, one of the questions for Jeff, and I know that, I just want to say the financial incentives, it's important to note that these incentives are based on the number of new units above and beyond the existing zoning. So pretty much large sections of VCOD allow 16 units per acre by right. So the 40R, if we did it in that particular area, would only take advantage of the 4 units. So that's something to keep in mind, is like, this might work better in an area that doesn't have any high density at all now anyway, because we're talking about the increase beyond what's already allowed by right. And we have a lot of options that are allowed by right in the VCOD, so I just wanted to point that out.
Any comments from the public? Yes, your name, please?
Hi, Courtney Butler, Chair of the Yarmouth Community and Economic Development Committee. Very happy to be here
Courtney.
tonight. Very happy to see you all. Thank you so much for those comments. Those were spot on with exactly what we were talking about last night. My full-time job is I work for the town of Brewster, and they're doing a lot of similar studies and analysis. And a quote that I heard that we talked about last night that was really good was, that we're not in a tourism economy anymore. We're in a second homeowner economy. And so it's really, we're seeing a shift of not only people, you know, a lot of the second homes we've noticed in our neighborhoods are being used by families. It's not so much of the short-term rentals anymore. It's staying in a family, turning over. And then alternatively, seeing people move here more for longer terms. You know, they maybe did the 6 months and a day where they live in Lexington or Pittsfield or wherever, and they're kind of switching it a little bit. And so we talked last night about moving ahead and how do we create these jobs, right? If you have a business that you run successfully in some other part of the state or the country, how can we make it so you want to bring that business here? So you want to open your shop here, open your law firm here, open your practice here, create jobs, do all of that stuff. So we are very excited and encouraged by all of your comments and by these studies being done tonight. And we're behind you 100%. And we feel exactly the same way, that this is a town that, has a lot of great opportunity. And we have a lot of great people leaving, which is too bad. But we also have a lot of great people coming here, and who are choosing to stay here longer, and that's really encouraging as well. And so we're trying to find ways to tap into those people, make them feel welcome, make them really be aware of what's going on in the town, and understand that Yarmouth is a great community to be in for 12 months out of the year, 7 months in a day, however long they want to be here, but to really engage them. So thank you so much for those comments, and I appreciate all that you do for the town. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you, Courtney.
Yeah. Anyone else? Do we have a couple of remotes?
Well, I don't know if Deirdre has any.
Oh,
comments.
Deirdre? I'm sorry. Deirdre, hello.
Well, hello. No more comments at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I almost forgot you, sorry.
No, never forgotten.
No problem.
Oh, you got to come up to a mic.
You have to come
Yeah,
to-
please.
Just a compliment. It's incredibly valuable to have this summary. I read it this afternoon and thought, wow, it really is very good. Here's the history and everything wrapped up in one. Oh, and here's the results. So with the additional units, the additional couple of examples, I think will be very helpful. But I really could say thank you, very good job.
Do you mind telling us who you are? Because I've never met you.
I'm Pete Malpass. I'm on Community Economic Development.
Nice to meet you, Pete.
I'm a resident of South Yarmouth,
Nice to meet you.
down
Thank you,
by the
Pete.
water, where the water table has dropped 6 feet because they've been pumping the water out to make the sewers. It's great. All those people, I mean, $600 a month electric bill for your sump pump is now zero.
Kathy, could I just ask Jeff one question? Jeff, when you were doing your recommendations, if you had to prioritize these or pick one that you thought you could have the most impact as quickly as possible, which one would you pick out of the preliminary recommendations? If you were a king for a day and you could pick one and put it into action, which one do you think would have the most impact and the easiest to implement?
That's a great question, and I would 100% defer to Kathy and some of this. But
If you could pick one.
I think no, honestly, professionally speaking, I think working to consolidate the permitting requirements, just making sure that whatever chance there is that a project proponent, an applicant, only goes to. I mean, the design review. I think it sounded like that was going to stay, and so I think that was acknowledged. Like, we're acknowledging design review might stand alone, but in terms of the actual regulatory review process, really consolidating, preferably with the planning board. And I know there was a comment, I think Kathy made it about there's moving parts to that as well, which is the workload, and there might be concern of authority and who's regulating what. But I think the idea of consolidating into one regulatory board would be, I think it would be something that most town meeting members would understand, that you're not taking away a review process, you're consolidating it, and I think it has the most likely chance of getting through, the scrutiny of town meeting. Whereas I think secondarily, I think we're considering reducing the commercial space requirement might be a second option, but I know that that's going to be more challenging. There's more questions and there's more analysis that would probably come with that. So I would go with consolidating the permit requirements, because I think there's amount of time you have enough time to do it, and then it would queue up projects who, if you have property owners who are thinking about stuff in the next year or two, they'll know that they have a more consolidated permit process to engage with, and that might be beneficial.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? But thank you, Jeff, for that. Don't you want to, if you want to consolidate the permitting requirements, don't you also need to take a crack at recodification too? I mean, you can still, and I don't want to get into the details about the timing, but it feels like at least maybe in a multi-phase approach, like maybe there's a way to just take some of the footnoting. I'm saying this because it's easier for me to say, because I don't have to necessarily do all the work. But in my head, it's one thing to say, we're going to make the permitting process streamlined, but if you're going to keep this beautiful mosaic that we have, then is that really also helping to accomplish that goal? When there might be an opportunity to streamline that as well.
I
Something to
don't think
consider.
that that's as simple of a process.
Not- bummer.
I think Jeff hit a good one on the head, because that's something that's very simple. The only concern I have is then a lot more projects are probably going to be coming to you guys, which is going to be more staff work. So maybe that becomes more staff in the planning department in order to address that. I mean, that's what we want. I mean, that's
what
a
we're doing
good
this
thing.
for.
That's
Yeah.
a good thing. But I would also want to do something with the architectural and site design standards sooner rather than later, because I think it's very important that when people are coming, and people are coming and talking about projects, that we're ensuring that we're getting it looking like what we want it to look like on Route 20.
And I recognize these all happen at different speeds and on different timetables, but it is interesting to hear, and I'm glad you asked the question, Susan, about the prioritization of it, because we've talked big picture, Madam Chair. I think it was a couple of meetings ago, looking beyond special town meeting into whatever the future holds for the big picture work we're trying to do after the LCP, God willing, is done. It's these kinds of issues that I'm assuming will form that agenda for 2026. Thank you.
One of the action items in the LCP is considering rewriting the whole thing. So I wouldn't want to go through a recodification and then 2 years down the line,
Right.
Okay.
that would,
Thank you.
Madam Chair, can I just make one comment? And Jeff, thank you for that comment, because I actually put a little star next to
Do it.
when we were going through the thing about consolidating the permitting requirements, because I think it's hugely important. But the one piece that, moving forward, that I'd like to see stricken from this is to do nothing. I truly believe that if we have that on there and we do nothing, we're going to continue to have the growth that we've had, whether we want it or not. I think that should go.
Sounds good.
Establishing
Sure.
the polls.
I
Yeah,
understand,
no,
but
that's a
I get
point.
it, but.
You don't want that to be any official position,
Exactly right.
possibility. I
Yep.
get it. Yeah,
I guess none of us have ever said that.
No, and I respect that, Madam Chair.
No, no, but none of us have ever said do nothing.
Right.
So,
we're always doing something. I guess I wanted to point out the permitting projects
agree.
and the breakdown. I think the mixed-use ones that haven't happened are all around Great Island Plaza, okay? And those got permitted at a time that was right before COVID. And then a lot of bad things happened during COVID. There's some rumblings of some things going on there. I do know that I think maybe the 612 is waiting for sewers to come through. But there might be some things that are moving forward with the Great Island Plaza. But these are the ones that were permitted a long time ago and were never built. Anything that was recently approved as J-Mart is moving forward. These people are working very hard to move forward with 811 Main Street. I'm not exactly sure where the car dealership stands. But in these other ones, like the Habitat for Humanity, that's in the early stages. That's one case where they were going to do the project in Yarmouth with a septic system, but we talked to them about it, and they said, you know what, we had another project in Brewster that we were going to do second. We'll just switch them, and we'll wait until we're ready to do that, and you have the sewer going. So things like that, people are making some, like Habitat, who has multiple projects in multiple towns, is making changes. But all these other ones here are in early stages of permitting and design, or have been permitted and designed. So these are very, very promising to come forward. So it doesn't look as bad as it really is. It's really this one intersection that really needs to be. And this might be a case where if we had a redevelopment authority or something like that, they could have been snatched up and something else be done. But I do think that something is going to be coming forward in those, hopefully.
I also think we have to recognize the impact that the sewer project is going to have on development.
Yes.
Especially if you're sitting there trying to pencil something out, and it's a difference between, $500,000 investment in the sewer, and then 3 years later, you're going to be able to hook. That's a big decision.
Absolutely. it is.
And the water project is going to drive a lot of these ancillary business decisions because it is so profound in our neighborhood now.
Well then, Madam Chair, as we think about working backwards and looking at 2026, maybe we need to just start thinking backwards from 2028 or 2029. And then that might inform how we try to prioritize some of these solutions, so that when all this stuff
Comes together.
merges, that at least there's an easier glide path for things, or let me just say, the friction has been reduced.
Yeah. One good thing about consolidating the permitting process, that's almost administrative. That's something we almost totally control. There's not a lot of subjective, or personal opinions. It's fill out the form and send it in. If we can consolidate that, and it's controlled a lot by the staff and by the town, it's almost administrative in nature. That is a good reason, that's a good one to start with, because we don't have to do a lot of, like, quite frankly, in-depth analysis. We know what the permitting process looks like.
There's still a friendly conversation with our friends at the planning board.
Oh, yeah,
At the
definitely.
zoning board,
Yeah,
I would
definitely.
assume, about
But- right.
what that would look like.
Right.
But I don't think we'd leave them with tumbleweeds either.
No.
They'll have plenty on their plate.
Plenty to do.
That has
Exactly.
nothing to
It's
do
not
with
like we're
this.
going to eliminate special permits.
No, there's a lot of non-conforming lots and non-conforming structures in Yarmouth that keep
There's
people,
enough.
that keep the
Yeah.
ZBA very, very
Very
busy.
busy.
Right.
And that's, but that's the kind of conversation that they would certainly want to have.
Yeah. Okay, anything else? Okay. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Always a
and
good
Adam.
presentation.
I'm not
Yeah,
sure if you're
thank
going
you,
to
thank
hang
you.
with us for a while, or,
Yeah, I think Adam and I are going to stay on to listen to Union Studios presentation. So thank you very much for having us.
great.
Thanks, Jeff.
Jeremy, hi there.
Good evening.
How you
How
doing?
are you all doing? Good. So good to see you all again. I'm Jeremy Lake, again with Union Studio, and I'm also joined tonight by Erica, who's one of my colleagues here at Union. She's both the brains and the beauty of our team, so I'm not really exactly sure what I bring to the table, but we're going to tag team the presentation here, the stuff that we've been working on and pulling together. So I'm glad she's able to join us too. I should also point out that Nate Kelly of Horsley Witten Group is listening in as an attendee. They're helping us, look closely at the zoning piece. I think he'll have a much bigger part of the next time we're in front of you guys, but I'm excited that he's online and listening so we can hear the conversation that we're having and that you've already been having. I think one of the things that's really exciting is doing this in tandem with what the BSC group is working on. It's nice that they're kind of looking at the really broad, big picture issues while we're really focusing in on, specific examples and understanding how it kind of meets the ground, if you will. So I think it's interesting that we're approaching this from both ends, if you will. So with that, I think we can jump in. Go ahead, Kathy, to the next slide. So, I just want to point out, I think our marching orders were really to focus in on the VCOD district. Again, it was very interesting to hear from BSC Group how there are these sort of multiple overlays that impact this area. We definitely agree it's probably a little bit overly complicated at the moment, and it's not surprising that it's that way because we know how these things evolve over long periods of time with lots of best intentions, but they can get kind of muddy as time goes by. And that's why it's important to do things like this where you kind of step back and say, how do we really want to proceed and move forward? But again, our marching orders were really to kind of focus in particularly on the VCOD area and regulations. Next slide, Kathy. And just as a reminder of our process, pretty short fuse here that we're working on with you guys. I was on with you guys a month ago, kind of introducing this effort and what we were going to be working on. We've been, doing some work behind the scenes with town staff. We're here tonight to share with you guys this sort of some schemes that we've done, and some just initial thoughts that at least Erica and I have around the zoning that we're going to have Horsley Witten help us flesh out a little bit more. We are still in the midst of scheduling a panel discussion with. To approach, fiscal feasibility, talking to some of the local developers, the local development community to get sort of their input and thoughts about what they see as being the real hurdles, with the goal being to then come back to you guys again here in a few weeks and sort of share what we've learned, share what we've come up with as a result of what we hear from you tonight and some of the things that we'll keep working on here in the coming weeks. Next slide. So as a reminder, when I was there with you guys a few weeks ago, the approach we said that we were going to take was really to look at 3 illustrative sites, and the thought was to make these sort of generic. We don't want to freak anybody out that we're looking literally at the old Blockbuster site or whatever the case might be. It really was to say, here's a generic idea of a 1-acre site, a 2-acre site, and a 3-acre site. And then we also tried to tee those up so that there were different sort of conditions or pressures that they might be addressing. So, the 1-acre site is a mid-block parcel, so there's neighbors on either side, so the real pressure is just on the frontage on Route 28. And maybe that one backs up to a wetland wooded area, so there's no residents in close proximity. Whereas when we look at the 2-acre site, we said let's make that a corner condition where maybe the commercial uses extend along the corner on that road, so there might be a little bit of pressure on 2 roads to have a little bit of a commercial presence. And then on to the 3-acre site, again, also thinking of that as a corner, but maybe on a corner where the commercial pressure's on Route 28, but once you kind of turn off onto that side street, you're pretty quickly into some residential fabric. So maybe that creates a different sort of set of constraints, opportunities, challenges to think about. We also, in theory, thought of them separately as different districts, the VC1, the VC3, and the VC4 districts. Although to Jeff's earlier point, we also observed that there's not a whole lot of difference between them. They're very minor. So in some ways that was less important or less impactful in the things that we drew between the three. And we knew that going from sort of small, medium to large, we would expect there to be maybe one structure at the small end, multiple structures at the higher end, and that the mix of commercial to residential would probably vary as well. And again, for us, it was just a matter of testing those things out, seeing what things rose to the top as being issues that were something we thought were a challenge or things we should talk about, or things that didn't feel like they were as big a deal, that we didn't feel like we had to worry about or bring up tonight. So again, just wanted to remind you that was the exercise that we were planning on doing, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. Next slide, Kathy, please. So one thing we wanted to talk about before we jump in is that there really are a number of variables at play. And so when we looked at these schemes, we tried to settle in on a typical condition so it would feel a little bit like apples to apples to apples instead of playing with every variable that could be played with. You could create a matrix of infinite variations on these things, and that wasn't going to be particularly useful, instructive, or intuitive. So first and foremost, when we talk about mixed use and we talk about there being a commercial component, obviously what that commercial component isn't determined in this particular exercise, right? And so it could be anything from, a realtor's office up to a restaurant or, a t-shirt shop, whatever the case might be. There could be a variety of uses that are in those buildings. And when a project comes in front of you, it probably has a pretty good sense of what that use wants to be, even if it's just categorically, not necessarily a specific user. And what's really important to understand is that it has a big impact on the parking consideration. So, we listed a few of the examples here just to show you that there is a big range between the minimum to maximum depending on the use. And so we might see anything from, the business services, the third bullet there, at the minimum end is only one space per 1,000. So that's not a whole lot of parking required. Whereas if we look at the finance, insurance, real estate, at the maximum end, it's 1 per 200 square feet, which is to say 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet. So even in these couple examples we shared, the commercial parking might be anywhere from 1 to 5 per 1,000 square feet. And for this exercise, we said it looked like a reasonable sort of middle ground, especially if we're trying to think of it more at the minimum end of the spectrum, might be something like the 1 per 500, which is to say 2 per 1,000. So for the studies we did, we said, let's do the commercial space parked at 2 per 1,000. But again, that could be higher, it could be lower. That would have an impact on some of these yields. But that was just something we wanted to kind of, set a line in the sand so that we would know what it is we were referring to. I should also point out that we conveniently dodged the issue of food establishments, restaurants. Those requirements are on a per occupant basis. So until you really dive in and design the restaurant and know if it's a fine dining establishment with a few seats or, a quick carry-out place that might be a very small footprint but with a lot of, use, the restaurant is even harder to capture, and in fact, we often see that the restaurant uses require even more parking than maybe the 4 per 1,000 or the 5 per 1,000. So again, it can be kind of a little bit complicated if you really get into it, but we just thought, let's, for the sake of this, say 2 per 1,000 is a sort of the baseline that we're going to use for the studies that we looked at. Similarly, the residential units, we knew there would be a residential component, but what that residential component isn't determined at this point either. Certainly if they're studios, they're much smaller, it can be a much smaller footprint versus if they're all 3-bedroom units. And obviously they can range in sizes. So again, we just said, let's land on something that feels like a reasonable middle ground that's also just an easy number to wrap your head around. So an average of 1,000 gross square feet per unit. And it's important there to note gross square feet per unit, because when you look at things like multifamily, gross is inclusive of the corridors, the elevators, the utility spaces, some of those things. Often a building is about an 85% efficiency, so say that's really a net square footage of about 850 square feet per unit, which is kind of like somewhere between a 1 and 2 bedroom unit. So for us, again, that was another one of these lines in the sand that we just wanted to draw to say, okay, we could twist ourselves in knots trying to consider every condition, but this is maybe a reasonable sort of median condition to help with these illustrative examples. Next was thinking about residential parking. Similarly, the range there is a little bit tighter. So at least currently for the multifamily and the VCOD, it's a minimum of 1 space per unit, a maximum of 1.5 spaces per unit. So we just said, let's do something right in the middle of 1.25. And I know that's one of the topics that we're certainly going to be talking probably a bit about tonight, is whether or not those should be higher, could be higher, should be lower, could be lower. But again, we felt like that was a reasonable starting point. And because we don't know what any of those uses are above, shared parking was also something we didn't necessarily get into trying to calculate for, because you need to know the use to figure out how effective or not the shared parking in is. And I think for me, one of the real takeaways was in some of these where it might feel like the parking is a little bit ambitious in terms of being maybe at the lower end of what the developer might ultimately want to build out. If you can take advantage of a shared parking scenario, that might create a little bit of that cushion that might be missing, or that might not be as well represented here as it could otherwise be or might be. But so for the time being, we've kind of couched shared parking, but I do think it's an important consideration to still have in the back of our mind as we think about these scenarios. So before we jump into the scenarios, are there any questions about that notion or this approach?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I'll just touch on it for a second. Jeremy, thank you. On the parking, I mean, parking certainly has to be, it's a huge consideration. I personally run a retirement community, and the reason I bring it up is we, in today's standards from when the property was built, don't have enough parking. It's real simple. People have, everyone drives a car. Most families have, 2 cars now. So I just think that erring on the side of the low side, I think would err in the side of being wrong. I really think just looking at these numbers, the 1.5 per unit on the residential seriously needs to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, I also had a brief conversation with Kathy this morning, Jeremy. We just had recently a couple of projects on Route 28 where the parking was an issue, and the developer went back and worked it out to be 2 spaces after initially submitting a plan that was 1.5, because we all looked at it and said, this just is not going to work. A 1-bedroom is going to have 2 people. So that's one of the assumptions, I guess. I would ask that as we go through it, and I know this is your first shot at this and sharing this with us, I think the model is a good one. Yep. I really like the model in terms of trying to limit the combinations and permutations that you could have on this. I fully appreciate that. But I do think residential parking, we need to move closer to 2.
Yeah, and again, I think for us too, it's ultimately sort of a bake in as much reasonable flexibility as you can so that the developer can propose what is appropriate or not appropriate for their particular project, right? So it can vary on a number of, needs or reasons, or, one thing that's kind of interesting when we always talk about density, it's sort of agnostic as to what type of unit it is. So if you can tell the developer they can build 8 units, their incentive is probably to build the 8 biggest units they can, because that's what's going to bring the highest return. And that might also then need the highest parking demand. Whereas if you could think about it in a different way, maybe incentivizing smaller units also incentivizes units that might have less parking requirements. So, it's all interconnected, it's all tangled. And again, I think we can keep talking that through. And it is a good point. But again, I think our exercise was meant to be an illustrative one, and we'll talk about this even as we go through these scenarios. We do kind of point out this idea of if the parking was higher, what impact does that have? And so we'll get to that in a bit. But yeah, I appreciate those comments.
Yeah, when you move up to 2, it really will affect what you can do on the site. We fully appreciate that.
Yep.
Okay, well, should we keep going and get through the schemes?
Sure,
I know
yep.
we'll certainly circle back to a number of these things as well. So, Erica, I'll pass it over to you at this point.
So we'll first go through the scenarios as Jeremy mentioned. So this is the first site we looked at, which was the 1-acre site. And when we looked at this one, this was looking at the BC3 district. Again, not much you'll see, like that doesn't affect too much between our renderings, but I did want to point that out. So in this case, we're showing the building on it's a single building, mixed use building where you have commercial on the ground floor and residential units above. And so we've tested this out with the 16 dwelling units per acre. So it's a pretty simple sort of illustrative diagram. We have the building in the front and the parking in the back. I'm trying to illustrate that the zoning where we're connecting potential connections to the neighboring sites. And that also the zoning recommendations for the parking buffers and landscape requirements. Next slide. And then here is a rendering just showing what that might look like. And you can see on this small site, it does, it's a fairly large building for the parking. So I think it's something for to consider as far as what the actual uses might be in the market. But we're showing a 3-story building here with that commercial entry along the street, showing what that might look like with the future updates to Route 28, the shared use path, and the sidewalk on the northern side of the street there, and then a walkway to the back to get to the parking easily. Next slide.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah.
On the 1 acre commercial building, 1 story.
Yes, we'll go to that here next.
Oh, I'm sorry.
They haven't talked about it yet.
Way ahead of myself. I apologize. Sorry.
No,
Erica.
it's because we've added
Sorry
these
about
renderings
that.
that you don't see in your package, right? So, surprise, there's renderings.
It's
But
okay. I apologize.
no, so let me speak to it real quick, and then we'll take your question about it, which is just when we then, one of the things we were thinking about just to illustrate the point was that you could take what essentially is the exact same scheme, at least 2-dimensionally, of having a building in front and the parking in back. But really, if you were just to adjust the parking ratios, if it was a commercial building that wanted to park it more like 4.5 spaces per 1,000, and there was nothing magic about that number other than we had 36 spaces behind it, so that's just sort of where the math landed. But as I illustrated on some of those uses at the higher end of the allowed maximums, you could have 4 or 5 per 1,000, depending on what the use is. But you can see how that same site suddenly doesn't have the capacity or the ability to also incorporate residential above. We also then did the same thing, thinking conversely, if on a residential basis with the 16 units that we had, if suddenly they were looking for more parking, and again, we had 36 spaces shown, so it worked out to 2.25, but be it at 2 with 4 less parking spaces back there, you still get the point that, what is otherwise almost the exact same 2-dimensional plan, when you go to the 3rd dimension, you just don't have as much stuff in the building because, you're losing square footage inside because you only have so much parking and back to support it. If you truly are convinced or you legitimately have a use that requires something more than some of those benchmarks that we were showing. So again, just pointing out that when you start playing with these variables, it can have a real impact on what the ultimate yield might be. And I think this is also a way of just thinking about the image on the left is essentially what you have out there today. You have a lot of commercial uses with a big parking lot in front of them, probably calculated at numbers like 4 per 1,000, and that's why it looks the way it looks. And so it really is having to sort of chip away at those expectations and find ways of incentivizing folks to think a little bit differently, or letting people pivot to uses that are less demand, or to Jeff's point, allowing them to build maybe more residential and a little bit less commercial, even though this is the ideal spot for a mixed-use zone, just so that you can find something that is that reasonable balance that everybody is hoping to achieve.
Great, thank you.
All right, we'll keep going.
Okay. I can go to the next slide. Great, so this is a 2-acre site. So again, we're showing the 16 units per acre. We have about 13,000 square feet commercial. All right, let me check my number on that.
18,000.
18,000, thank you. This was small for me to read there. And 32 units. And so this one worked out to be a similar actual percentage to the first site. So we are still looking at about 36% commercial to 64% residential, which was sort of just some of our goals that we were looking at before. We've kept to this where it's still all mixed use frontage, but because we have that residential district that the site's backing up to, and it worked out to balance the site a little bit, we were able to step down that mixed use building C to 2 stories. So that's just kind of something that we would typically want to do in our projects, and it worked out here that was a nice thing to do, and to keep that 3-story density up on Route 28 as opposed to wrapping it around to the residential as well.
May I ask a quick question, Madam Chair?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Erica, a quick question. Have you ever, when you've done these presentations, have you ever considered, because some of us, at least my weird brain, I think in percentages, is it possible in future versions that we could see the residential percentage and the commercial percentage on this page. And again, I know I can do the math, but I think there might be other people that might look at this and go, okay, just tell me, is it 50-50? Is it 45-55 or 68-32? Is that something that would be hard to do? And if so, would you mind doing it? If not, I should say.
Yeah, we can definitely do that.
All right. And obviously, it's up to for your consideration. It would help.
In fairness, Erica did have it on there, and I had her take it off to try to keep the thing simple so that people would focus. I told
Erica,
you,
the plan. Erica, the plan
Yeah.
worked. We did it.
Yeah.
We did it, Erica. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, so we can show the rendering now too, which will help illustrate that plan. Thanks. So yeah, so here you can see we're showing that corner building, and we're just trying to demonstrate this, something that we would like to consider. We often do this third floor treatment. So that building, even though it's 3 stories, we're trying to bring down the scale a little bit so that it reads more like a 2.5 story, even though it's 3. And then in the back, that steps down to the 2 story, and again, you have that drive to the parking behind.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is that particular instance is something that we observed in the design standards. You know, it defines a dormer very specifically as sort of a single window dormer, kind of like what we showed on the other buildings in that rendering. But this tactic that we'll often use of trying to treat the upper floor as if it's tucked into the eaves of the roof. You know, we almost don't call it a dormer because then it triggers that definition of a dormer. So it's just like a treatment on the 3rd story. But I think it is one of those things that, you know, as we move forward, and we'll talk about some of our recommendations, it's one of those things we think you should look closely at and consider, because in some ways we've found done well, this is an effective way of helping sort of bring the visual scale of the building down, even though it's still 3 stories. You initially read it as a 2-story building that just happens to have some uses up in the roof. So again, it's a minor aside, but it's I think an important aside that we saw in the regulations that we wanted to potentially suggest thinking about a little bit differently.
Was there a question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Nope.
No, okay. So for the 3rd site here, coincidentally also 3 acres, we have here we have the density is allowed at 16 dwelling units per acre, but you can see we've actually ended up a little bit over on that. So we're showing a 17.3 units per acre, and for the percentage folks in the room, that's 20% commercial and 80% residential that we're showing. So it's keeping to that original goal. So then we ended up a little bit over on the residential there. So, but you know, we could still drop the 4 units, probably still look very similar in form, just reducing some of the heights of the buildings or size of the units. So here we're showing mixed frontages. So we have just the mixed use buildings on the front that would be fronting Route 28. And then when you turn the corner onto the secondary road, you have the small side of that mixed use building, but then residential in the back. And we were able to show a little bit of open space there too, so that those residential units can open out onto their own little public common green there. And something to note that both actually for this site and the previous site that I failed to mention was that these are both corner lots. So for the secondary road, just to remind us all that setback is a greater minimum setback than what you have for Route 28. And so here, I think we've covered everything on that one, so we can go to the next slide. All right, and so here's the rendering again, showing that 3rd floor treatment that we've talked about before on the corner. Because of that setback, that allowed us to have a little bit of a plaza there on the corner. And then we have the mixed-use buildings going down and then showing the residential in the back. And that steps down to 2 stories, which, you know, is a lot more, I think, palatable to the neighbors there. But you can see it does create this interesting condition that might want to be considered for the setbacks when it has the setbacks so much greater to the Route 28, where we're looking at really like 15 foot setbacks from the minimum. It's just an interesting condition, so it might be something to consider how that is treated on the site, and maybe it doesn't have to be along that whole secondary road. Maybe there's a residential, similar type of residential buffer you have in other conditions, but it's definitely something to think about. What happens with that area on that secondary road on the slot?
I did also want to mention, I think when I was in front of you guys a month ago, one scenario I thought we might be showing on this one was residential in the back, but maybe only commercial in the front, such that the site overall was still mixed use, even though building by building it wasn't mixed use. And what we found when we actually drew it up, because we had a bigger lot, we had a fairly large, efficient parking area in the middle, we were able just to achieve a little bit higher density. It's why we actually kind of tipped over a little bit beyond the 16 per acre that's allowable. But it is something I think is worth still thinking about, considering that if a project wanted to do, commercial only buildings and residential only buildings, still creating mixed use overall, that's not an unreasonable condition to consider and allow for. Certainly provides a little more flexibility in what the commercial spaces might be, might provide more flexibility on how they are financed. If it was phased and one is purely commercial and one's purely residential, that tends to open up more options for financing, et cetera. So it was something we thought we might be showing in this, and ultimately we didn't end up going that route. But you could picture that scenario kind of like we did with the 1 acre site, that if we thought about parking ratios a little bit different, it wouldn't be unreasonable to imagine some or all of the buildings in front being purely commercial, parked at a slightly higher ratio with the residential component in back, where it creates a nice transition to the existing residential fabric that might be beyond.
Madam Chair, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So, thank
ahead.
you. So for Jeremy and Erica, I guess I have a COVID-related question. So the question is, when you think about parking in a mixed use especially, but certainly in a residential project, do you assume that people leave and go to another place in their car Monday through Friday, 9 to 5? Is that built into the assumptions that people go to a physical place to go to work?
Good question.
I think it's a great question, and I think it's something that is probably not completely understood, in part because it varies so much. I do think there are a lot more people working from home these days than they might otherwise, that probably would have an impact on some of the assumptions really about the shared parking, right? It's probably the shared parking formula that this would come up as a question for. I think if you're already assuming there's 1.5 or 2 spaces per unit and they're there all day, that should be fine. It's really when you're trying to free up, okay, but during the day an office is in the ground floor, couldn't they be using those spaces because some percentage of those folks are going away? And that's why I think the shared parking doesn't assume 100% of the residential parking spaces suddenly become available. It already builds in an assumption that some number of folks are home.
Sure.
I don't remember what your current shared regulation formulas are. We could kind of look at that and think about that a bit, although I think the way it's written, the residential doesn't get impacted. It's really what the commercial uses are affiliated with the site.
Well, yeah, because it works. Yeah, it works both ways. I mean, you don't want the businesses to not have any free parking because there are more people who don't leave Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And I guess as a quick side note, I would imagine as an industry that you and Erica work in, if you're ever looking for a topic to have a lot of smart people talking about what's going on around the country in terms of how projects are, thought of and conceptualized and then actually planned and permitted. I mean, you could do a whole conference on how the work-home balance has been fundamentally shifted. But I agree with you, Jeremy, it's hard to measure because there's so many different factors, mostly geography, I would imagine, but not exclusively. But I just wanted to bring up the topic because I know there are people that we were talking about more people coming to the Cape. Well, I think it's fair to say, as Susan said before, unless we're creating physical places where people can work and afford to then live here, then the kinds of people who are going to relocate here are probably going to be working from their home. Again, I'm being completely simplistic about this, but it is an issue that we have to grapple with, and it doesn't feel like it's going back ever again. So I just wanted to bring it up. I know you have a lot to think about, but if you guys are ever looking for a fun conference topic, when you guys go off to your next conference, you guys should be the lead speakers, and then you don't have to do anything. You just show up and say, okay, COVID percentages for work-life balance, discuss, and then you have your continuing ed credits all taken care of. I assume there's literally conference topics about this in your world, and I never had to think about it until, Ken and I were just sort of giggling at each other because we were kind of like, well, there's not enough parking except for nights and weekends. Right. But then it made me think, well, what about Monday through Friday? Anyway, I've beaten this issue into the ground, but it's just more interesting stuff that you brought us up to think about.
No, and I think what's also interesting, though, is, I think the ideal principle behind mixed use is that ultimately the folks that live in this neighborhood would also shop in this neighborhood and eat in this neighborhood, and they wouldn't necessarily be driving and parking to do that, right? So some of these things can kind of balance themselves out. And I think one of the things we were even thinking about is it's hard in the current condition of Route 28 to imagine, this more aggressive thinking about parking ratios. But if you could fast forward 15 years and this thing was really highly built out with a number of mixed uses in there, and there's a bike lane, and so suddenly maybe someone says, yeah, we don't need a second car because I can bike to my job or whatever the case might be. Like, that's why I do like the idea of there being sort of minimums and maximums, because in some ways the hope would probably be that over time people are trending more towards the minimums because this built-in lifestyle, this built-in model that we're all hoping this thing facilitates might allow for less car usage, or suddenly creates these dense nodes where mass transit becomes a little bit more viable. So it is a little bit of a chicken and egg scenario. We can't help but look at the condition out the window today, and so we say, oh my God, we got to have 2 cars for everybody. But at some point, maybe we don't. Maybe some of these things change. Maybe there's other options that are put into place.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yep, you're welcome.
I think the idea was always to have a minimum and maximum. It's just a question, is one the right minimum?
Right.
We're finding that maybe that's not. But the maximum at 1.5 is obviously causing problems, and we do need to allow for some flexibility. If someone says, I really need 2, they shouldn't have to go get a special permit in order to get 2 if they feel that they need it. Like the 811 Route 28, that was really like 8 townhouses for professional couples, was exactly the answer to the question of who do you think's you're going to be renting to? And it's like, well, then that's 2 cars.
Definitely.
So something to think about.
But you could also, I just want to push back on that. I agree, and I'm glad that they made that tweak. But you could also make an argument that, and I know this because in the business that we're in, that we're seeing a lot more parents where maybe now it's just one parent that leaves the house every day and not both. I know that your mileage may vary, pun intended, but I don't know. I just think it's worth continuing to think about this issue. But I agree, 1 doesn't make a sense at all. Certainly heading towards 2 does, and maybe there's some sort of common ground that could be possibly found.
Okay, we'll continue.
That's right.
All right, what's next, Erica?
So this slide was here just to kind of bring us back to talk about our code considerations, and just it's kind of been touched on a little bit already, so we won't talk about it too much more. But we were just again trying to highlight that we have these 4 different districts, and as we were looking at it and laying out the plans, we didn't see too much dimensional differences, except for say maybe the VC2 between them. So it's just something again for some consideration. Next slide. And so another topic that came up when looking at the zoning code with the town was, whether or not these unit sizes that exist as minimums within the code are at the right number. And so when we looked at it, we decided, we noticed you had already done this benchmarking study. And so we looked at that benchmarking study and the units that have been built and what the range of sizes were. And when you're looking at the average, it looks like you're fairly on par. However, you can see there's a lot that are lower. And I think for us, potentially our recommendation is that maybe this isn't something that needs to be regulated in the end. So if it's not really working for the town, I think the market's going to try to create a nice marketable unit that can be rented or sold, and that, hopefully they're not going to end up as a substandard unit in the end. That next slide.
Yeah, I was just going to say again,
Go ahead.
I think the concern is always that there's going to be some dastardly developer that comes in and builds some crazy small units, but we just never observe that really happening. I mean, in the end, they still need to get it financed. They still need to talk about it with a lender who's got to be convinced that it's a viable, marketable thing. And so, most zoning codes don't speak to unit sizes. So it's not to say that you shouldn't or couldn't, and that we could continue to think about that, but again, we were asked specifically to think about, are these minimums the right minimums? And maybe they should be a little bit lower just to provide more flexibility. Or again, we just question, do they even need to be there in the first place?
I do think that's one thing that we did talk about when we were looking at accessory apartments, like what were some of the reasonable sizes for a 1-bedroom. We had some examples and the minimum. The only other thing I would mention is that there are some minimum requirements with regard to the affordable units. So I think what we have in our zoning for VCOD is kind of what would be the minimum sizes preferred by the state. That doesn't mean that we don't go through the local process, and the Community Housing Committee will say, okay, we'll have a smaller unit, but we want you to reduce the rental rate by 10% or something along those lines. But that's kind of what those numbers are coming from the state with regard to minimum lot sizes for affordable units.
Okay.
We can go to the next slide.
You're there, you're just not seeing it yet.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
All right. And so for this one, we just wanted to make a note on the building height requirements. So right now, as it stands in the zoning code, you have a height for 3 stories not to exceed 35 feet, or 4 stories not to exceed 48 feet. And we've just put in the sort of long definition there, but that height, we have to keep in mind, is measured from the average existing grade. So if it's not a flat site, all of a sudden the 3 stories becomes a little bit challenging to reach, especially with a mixed use building. And so we have examples again from the benchmarking, but typically on the low end of a mixed use, like a commercial ground floor might be 12 feet when you include the structure. So, 10 feet of floor height, of ceiling height. And then you have your residential units above. So by the time you're done, you're looking at reasonably probably a 33-foot height just to the bottom of the eave, not including the roof. And so if you're looking for a really nice late designed building that's not necessarily a flat roof, having a little bit more flexibility in the height, or maybe redefining what that height is going to, will probably give you some better design options. Also, just put in a little note here, just that we know that you have some flood regulations already, but we did note that when you're looking at this and some of the recent maps, that parts of this district are looking at higher sea level rises or potential storm impact. And so as you're looking to redo your zoning potentially or add notes on it, there might be some considerations, and especially specifically looking at the building height, but also design standards, because buildings might need to get elevated down the road, and things like that will affect the building height. And so it's just something to consider. And I know that the Cape Cod Commission's also done some good work on this with design guidelines that can be referenced, but we just wanted to make that out. Next slide.
One of the things that we did take into consideration in the VCOD is that when you're in a FEMA special flood hazard area, you measure it's not measured from the average existing ground, it's 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So understanding that people may need to elevate in order to address that.
Yeah, and I think something that we're seeing as we've worked with some towns in this is that base flood elevation is not high enough in considering sea level rise and flood inundations from storm surge. So it's just something to consider, looking at, there's, some more recent mapping and different groups that are doing, maps that are coming out of Woods Hole that consider that, impending, I guess I don't want to call it a threat, but potential flood inundation at a much greater rate, greater height.
Understood.
So I just want to quickly reinforce, what Erica prior to that was also speaking to. When we see 3 stories, 35 feet, that's pretty standard as sort of like a residential standard, especially thinking of a smaller scale residential building. It's a really difficult metric for a mixed use building, because typically a commercial occupancy wants a slightly higher ceiling height. Like, think about, you don't often walk into a store and the ceiling's only at 8 feet high, unless it is a really historic building that was converted over time. A modern, tenant would want something more like a 10-foot ceiling height, or even a 12-foot ceiling height, depending on what the use is. So again, we think it's just specific to a mixed use district. It might make sense to build in a little more height. And I think the next slide we have was actually showing some of the heights of the benchmarking examples. Erica, maybe walk them through that as illustrative to that point.
Yeah, so we pulled some of the examples that were in that study and categorized them by, the 2.5 story, your 3 story, and your 4 story. And so if you look at these, the heights are listed at the bottom. I apologize, they are a little bit small, but on that 2 to 2.5 story range, you're looking at almost 30 feet to almost 38 feet, right? So the 35 feet, you can see, even has pressures at that 2.5 foot, 2.5 stories, sorry, building height. And so in the 3-story buildings, you can see that if you look at the top two, they're actually, one is the middle, you have the flat roof in the middle. And so that seems a little, that's pretty easy to probably get to the 35 feet. But then on the top, that's really a flat roof trying to treat itself like a mansard, trying to hide itself in that 2.5, but it's still, again, at pretty much 3-story flat roof. But then on the bottom, you can see that they actually have that pretty substantial commercial ground floor that Jeremy was speaking to, and then a true roof on top of the story, on top of the 3rd floor there. And so that building is what's actually at 52, almost 53 feet in height when you account for the grade and the commercial ground floor and the height of the roof pitch. And so it's just something we wanted to show in consideration. And again, on the 4-story, that actually is going up to almost 62 feet. So, they would be coming to for a variance if they were trying to get to the 4-story, most likely.
Yeah, I think some of those 3-story examples show you the architect started at what the maximum building height was, and then sort of had to work down from there instead of trying to come up with a composition that they really thought was an effective or nice or lovely composition. And I think even on the 2.5-story example on the bottom left, that one had almost like a true half-story in the ceiling. And even that couldn't quite come in under the 35 feet. And I don't know what they were using for varying ceiling heights, but I'm guessing that kind of lower left image is the kind of thing that we're all sort of hoping would be the case for what we might get here. And 35 feet is very difficult to achieve that in. Again, they're at almost 38 feet, and they're on a pancake flat site, and, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just, again, we see this is a regular occurrence for us when we come into communities and talk to them about building height. It's almost always set using the kind of same philosophy that's been in place for 60 years that assumes it's residential with at most 10 feet per floor, and they'll give you a couple feet for the roof, which doesn't usually result in architecture that anybody really cares for the look of.
So we can go to the next slide. So again, this, we talked a little bit about this, I think, but we can talk a little bit more about it. So something we noticed too is some of these side yard setbacks are a little bit complicated in the district. And so even though you see that 0 to 15 foot setback, the 0 foot is actually only permitted if there's an agreement with the abutting property owner, which we think, that some of these notes in here are actually great to have, and allowing for that 0 foot setbacks is great. I think it's just sort of the compounding effect of the different notes and elements that has to be put into consideration. And so when you're seeing on the sites that we've done too, where we're having to back up to a residential district, we then had to consider another note that says that the setback has to be equivalent to the building height or the setback in the chart, whichever one's greater. And so pretty much that always defaulted to the building height, because when you're looking at these buildings of 2 and 3 stories, the setback would become the building height and would definitely not be 15 feet. I don't think we'd see too many buildings at that height. And so that drove a lot of design decisions too. And so instead of reducing building height to get closer in the side setback, you then end up putting a parking drive aisle or a parking lane in order to compensate and still keep your building height at that edge. So we just think that there's already a residential buffer also that's required with 6 foot of landscape screening. And so we were kind of just wondering if maybe that residential buffer should be reduced from the 20 feet to something a little bit less. There's sort of a parking buffer, also landscape buffer of 10 feet, and then you have this 6 foot screening required to a residential district. And so that seems pretty sufficient with those 2 requirements, that you then end up kind of with like 14 feet of kind of unknown landscaping that's required. And that seems like it could be better utilized and given over to the site. So potentially we just, as we note down here, just looking at sort of reducing and redefining that residential buffer, taking into account that there are already all these other design requirements, and also looking at simplifying some of the setback requirements. Next slide. And that leads us up to our discussion. And if anyone has any questions on anything that we've noted over the past few minutes.
Any questions or comments? Yes.
I was looking at the ladder
You
truck.
if you could just say your name
Sorry,
again, Peter.
my name's Pete Malpass, and I'm just a resident here, but I was looking at one of the ladder trucks out front of the fire station that serves my area, and I don't think it goes more than about 36 feet. So could you have a ladder, is there a fire department limit on the height of your buildings? Because it can't rescue people from higher than a certain height. I was just wondering. My son's a firefighter in Virginia, I wondered. Thank you.
I don't,
It's a,
yeah. Go ahead, Jeremy.
I was just going to say, it is an important consideration. It's something you want to understand. I think what's worth noting is that, when we say 35 feet is the building height, that's to the upper ridge, at the very top of the building. So the window sills are much lower than that. So even if you go a little bit higher, a lot of the access they need can be done there. But it is an important question. Sometimes it's a matter of, what is the height to the eave, because that's what the ladder is going to lean against. So you would want to understand and coordinate some of that, but I wouldn't be surprised if the couple of additional feet we're talking about would be feasible, or maybe you bump it up for a 3-story building but not a 4-story building. Some of the setback requirements, we actually found it was very difficult for us to draw a 4-story building on any of these sites, save the 3-acre site. Our first scheme was putting a 4-story building sort of right in the middle of it so that it would, adhere to all the setback requirements, and it wasn't making sort of much sense. So we defaulted back to sort of that 3 stories everywhere. Maybe a concession is you only allow up to 3 stories and give up on the 4 stories, but let the 3 stories be at a sort of more meaningful and useful height. So I do think that's an important consideration that you raise, but I think it would be addressable as long as there was the right conversation had.
I think one of the conversations that Jeremy and I also had is, we all know what the fire department's concerns are with regard to getting their equipment in and turning it around. So there's going to be also some considerations that will probably impact parking as well when they come and say, oh, no, I need to be able to get the ladder truck around that, so you're losing those 2 parking spaces so that we can do that. We've tried to negotiate, and they've been very understanding, as they did on 811, and we came up with a solution that still provided for adequate fire safety, but didn't necessarily need that turnaround right in the back, which allowed them to get the 2 spaces to have the parking in the back. So it was a little bit of a negotiation, but we've had some other meetings with them. People they keep talking about turning the ladder truck around, and that's like turning a tractor trailer truck around on your property. So there's further discussions. I mean, there's regulations and codes that they need to meet, but my understanding is there's some, if you could maybe bring a hydrant in, or obviously it's a sprinkled building, it means something different as to how the safety of that. But that probably is something that we should at least mention somewhere in these, that, vehicle access, fire safety access vehicles need to be able to turn around or move safely through these developments.
I will point out, it is one of the advantages of this approach, though, of the buildings coming out to the street. You have great access to at least the fronts, maybe the side, from the public right of way. I think that one of the challenges in other scenarios is that the building's at the back end of a big parking lot. Now I've got to drive by 60 parked cars. Hopefully they're all in the right place. When you bring the building out to the street, I think it makes some of those access issues a lot easier. So you're right, it's still something when you would need to make sure worked on a case-by-case basis. Again, these are illustrative, but aren't dissimilar from things we're designing, in real life in various locations. So it's not an unsolvable problem.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
No.
Jeremy, I'm curious as to how you can help us with the 2 parking spaces for residential. Can you reset some of these plans to take that into consideration?
Show something, maybe show an example of one of them that
Yeah,
shows too, and kind
not all
of
of them
illustrate the
necessarily,
negative
but just-
impacts.
Yeah, that was a little bit what we were trying to sort of do quickly with that one, the first couple of examples on the 1-acre site,
Yep.
when you kind of swip the ratios, what happens.
Yeah, the
It wouldn't be hard for us
2.25.
at all. Happy to do that on some of the other parcels too. Like
Great.
maybe if we just said, let's look at the 3-acre parcel and assume it's 2 spaces per residential unit, and maybe even bump up the, retail parking a little bit too, to something that might be a more, common ratio that we might expect to see, and just see how it really does either knock away a few footprints or, certainly knock a few stories off of some of these as well, and where does that land us? So we can do that. That's a relatively easy exercise we can pull into the fold for the next.
Great.
I think it's important because as Jeff Bagg was talking, maybe we need to have more than 16 units per acre. But if we're finding that, can you really have even the 16 units per acre and 2 parking spaces and then have at least the 15% minimum commercial that we have as a requirement in the zoning? What does that happen? How does that happen?
Great presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy and Erica.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
guys. Yeah.
Very educational.
Oh, my goodness, yikes.
And having the illustrations are very helpful because I think, it shows, what good design can look like, which I think is very helpful. I do love the dormer. We're making that 3rd story kind of look like a half story. I think that looks significantly better than some of the things we've been seeing. So I'm really interested in hearing about more details on how we might be able to phrase that correctly in our zoning to get something along those lines.
So when do we think we'll see you again, Jeremy?
So we know that you'll see us again on June 25th. So
Okay.
we'll be back in a few
Great.
weeks. Again, we're going to meet with a developer panel sort of between now and then and take care of a few more of these items that we want to keep talking about. So we'll see you again soon.
Okay, great. Thanks again. Thank
All
you
right,
so
thank you
much.
guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night all.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, has that
Yes.
panel been developed?
I don't know.
We're working on it.
Working.
Yeah, but I think we have a list of ideas of some of the questions with regard to talking about capital and financing. Also, what are some of the market considerations for housing? What kind of users are you really seeing that being beneficial financially? Are you looking for young professionals? Are you looking for seniors? Are you looking for market rate? Is affordable the ones that are penciling out? Those types of things. And then also some considerations for the commercial. What kind of commercial do you see being that we kind of, in a sense, need in Yarmouth? Is it retail? Probably not. But is it restaurants and bars, or is it amusements and entertainment? Is it a microbrewery? Those type of things, you might find that there's information that, and is there any unmet commercial demand that they know of out there? I think identifying any land constraints or limitations we might have, are there site or location limitations? The size of the lots are small. I think that Jeff mentioned very astutely that we had these grandiose plans in 2012 that we're going to be combining these lots, and then people are going to be going in through limited access points, having the parking in the back, and there's going to be these separate roads in the back. Just didn't come to fruition because it's too difficult to actually combine those. Maybe some of the concerns are, it's too much traffic. 28, that's just not something we want. Or maybe they're concerned about what the streetscape looks like. It doesn't, we don't have bike ped access there, but you know what, guess what, we're getting it with the Mass DOT project. So there might be some things there that people have. And then just talking about some very specific zoning considerations that they might have, an input from them, obviously more by right options, whether we would be increasing the height or the stories that are allowed, increasing the density, not having any limits specifically in our bylaw on unit sizes, and that type of thing, and obviously simplifying the process. I think that's an easy thing that we might be able to hit pretty relatively. And then, that parking takes up a large portion. Do you have any other viable techniques to deal with it, whether it's shared parking? Should we be talking about public parking? Should we be talking about parking below buildings and that type of thing? And then just kind of saying, what do you see as necessary development incentives? What's helped you to make a project come to fruition? Was it the zoning? Was there zoning changes? Was there zoning that allowed that to happen? Was there a tax incentive financing? Was there some other way that the towns encouraged you to develop a mixed-use development? And then just kind of, is it easier to develop mixed use elsewhere? And if so, kind of like why? Why other areas, even other communities on Cape, like Harwich and Dennisport, seem to be seeing it? I'm impressed the fact that we've been seeing some mixed use already, but I'm really happy about that. But they're not fully constructed yet. So once they start putting pencil to paper, hopefully it all balances out for them. But that's certainly something that we do. So I have a list. We were originally, I think, going to try and get in touch with the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce because they meet with development groups on a regular basis, but that doesn't seem to be panning out. So we have obviously some developers that we know of. We're trying to get some financial institutions, but that's something that's probably going to have to happen, the week of June 16th in order to be able to get.
To meet this timeline, right?
Yes, to meet this grueling timeline that we have for the end of the fiscal year. So that's something that's the questionnaires kind of been developed that we would like to have the questions answered. We just need to see how many people we can get in the room together, and if they can't come, then maybe we can send them the questionnaire and they might be able to answer it and provide that information. So it's not going to be as in-depth or as detailed as I think we were all hoping, but because of the time crunch, we're
I
going
think,
to do the best we can.
Kathy, you'd have more success having it as an online, something that could be sent to them.
Yeah,
To,
yeah.
you know, because I just think this is the time of year, if you're a developer, you're trying to make hay, and either prior to the summer or you're as busy as you're going to be this time of year as a developer. Just I think you'd have more success having that question, which I think is great. Getting it in front of them and asking them, can they get it back to me by X?
Okay. The problem is with that is that I like the interactiveness.
I don't
If we can
disagree.
even if we get like 4 people together, that would be great, and then and other people can't. But definitely making it hybrid so people can Zoom in if they want to, and having these questions ahead of time so they've been thinking about it. It's all good ideas.
Courtney?
Hi, Courtney Butler. Yeah, I just want to say I'm so encouraged by this presentation. I think a lot of people, when they see these images and we're talking about little old Cape Cod, they kind of like clutch their pearls of like, oh my God, we could never have something that looks like that on my main street. But this is exactly what we've been talking about at the CEDC. These sorts of plans and ideas are some of the things that we had suggested for the Mad Keys property in terms of a mixed-use neighborhood, a community. There's a lot of young families who want to stay here, but they can't afford a house. But to have a little community, the Yarmouth Commons, all those kids are always playing around together. They're having a great time. Like, it's a really sweet little neighborhood. And I think this provides a lot of great opportunity for commercial, residential, like a really nice community. I'm just so encouraged to see these designs and your support for them, and I'm very excited to see where this all goes. Like Kathy said, we see other communities doing this, and like I always think of Harwichport, right? Like that vibrant little main strip is amazing, and now they do have the mixed use, and like you can park behind businesses, and you can walk around, and you can get to the beach, and that's what I want for Yarmouth too. I want everybody to, you can still have your cute little cottages and your cabins and all that away from Main Street, but I think in this sort of area, we're looking at a place that's really how you make a good main street that's walkable and feels like a community. And so thank you again so much. Big fan of your work, Yarmouth Planning Board. Thank you.
Thank you both for coming. We appreciate it. All
right.
Kath, what else do you want to talk about LCP?
I don't. Is Jeff still here? I know that
Yes, Jeff's still there.
Peter and Joanne and Deirdre had provided some information to Jeff to try and start compiling. I have not gone through myself. I'm negligent in having taken another look at things. I would certainly like to do that. But the date was trying to get something to the Cape Cod Commission by June 11th, which is next Wednesday. And maybe Jeff can kind of chirp in on how he feels we are standing there. Maybe we want to actually shoot for like June 16th, and I can maybe give a heads up to the commission that it's coming. At least gives a little bit more time to kind of think things through. But I would just ask Jeff kind of where he stands.
Yes, thanks. So far, at the last meeting, we got good feedback. Nothing too substantive, as of yet. We're still working out the capital facilities chapter. I think that's kind of where we are right now. And we have a tiny bit of flexibility. I agree with Kathy. I think maybe we put out June 11th. I was being very optimistic. It's important, and I think we want to really trudge through and get a draft ready to send. And I think what's really driving that is they talked about 3 or 4 weeks for the review, and then we would release the draft to the public. And I think the biggest wrinkle, when you stretch out the 4 weeks, is that there's the July 4th holiday kind of week. And so I think the 16th is a reasonable target. I think what I would like to try to propose is we try to get, Kathy can review what she already has, and then we can show her the updated housing and capital facilities chapter. I think those are where there's changes, and then really kind of shoot for either Friday next week or the 16th to get it to the Cape Cod Commission. I think within a couple days of that span, we want to keep on that timeline as much as possible as well. So I think we're close. I think the Wednesday is a little ambitious.
Yeah.
But I think we're pretty close, and I think we want to try to stick, within 5 days of that to try to get it to the commission.
If I may, my one major concern that I shared with Kathy in my notes to her was the capital plan section, I think, is, with the most recent one that I saw, was the weakest part and needed some, I think, serious development. I'd mentioned to Kathy the whole discussion about the operating budget. We don't need to talk about the operating budget. The capital plan is separately identified and approved, and there was kind of this mixture of numbers that I couldn't figure out, and I used to be on the capital budget committee, so if I couldn't figure it out, I was a little bit concerned. So I'm glad to hear you working on that, and I'm wondering if there's any chance that we can get a copy of whatever the latest version of that is when it's ready before the 11th. I would like to see it.
Before it goes to the commission.
Before it goes to the commission.
Right.
Well, just a process question, Madam Chair. Once it goes to the commission, Jeff, they're just giving their feedback because we still have
Correct.
opportunities to refine.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct, yeah, and I think collectively, we felt like it would be good to get it to the commission and get their feedback before we release the draft to the public, just
No,
to
I
understand
agree.
if they.
Right. I was just trying to remember.
I always think in terms of a little bit of triage. I could imagine a situation where if the capital facilities chapter is not ready, maybe there's, as I think Kathy, I think the planner at the commission did say that they would take any part of it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So
It's not
in
ready,
terms
we
of a
can-
triage approach, there might be an opportunity to take that one chapter out and get them the bulk of it. It's not ideal, but it is an opportunity, because I'm just worried about like your meeting schedule. My understanding is you might have a meeting on June 18th, and so I think if we wait to send the entire thing until after the 18th, we're gonna push out the schedule. I have the schedule up on my screen here, and one of the other targets that we have is holding a public hearing in August 20th. That there is some opportunity to push that into September and still meet the timeline to execute the warrant in October. But we're getting to this point where we want to try to get the draft to the commission as much as possible.
Well, I'm very happy to hear that, Jeff. I didn't realize that we can just leave the chapter out and work on it.
I mean, we could even send them probably, if we feel comfortable with the natural systems,
I mean, the rest of it I thought was,
pretty close.
it was that chapter in particular that I thought needed some attention.
And the economy, I think, needed some more data, and I think maybe Deirdre had helped a little bit with that. I haven't gone through all of that information. I just wanted Jeff to know that the planning board did send a letter to the town administrator asking to see if the special town meeting could be on November 18th. I think with the schedule we had been looking at was like November 4th. So he did send it to Ken Moody, who's the moderator, and he said no problem. And he also sent it to Mary Maslowski to make sure that would be okay with her, and we haven't heard back from her yet. But I'm assuming that if it's fine with those guys, and I can't imagine why Mary would have a problem with it, then I'm sure he would bring that before the select board, and hopefully they could maybe set the date for special town meeting earlier than they normally would to help us out.
Great.
Because we still have zoning to do.
Yay. More boat hearings. No, it's good. Important. It's important for the people. My apologies for the people that is passionate, and we're excited to have them.
So hopefully that gives us a little bit of leeway.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it does. I think that's helpful to know.
So,
to be reminded.
Jeff, might we see, meaning the planning board, a new, please don't take this the wrong way, because you're only working with the information that we give you, a new and improved chapter on capital by the 18th? Our next
yeah,
meeting?
definitely by the 18th. I think going by the 11th, I'm not sure it'll be.
No, we don't need, we wouldn't need it by then, as long as we can just exclude it.
Yes, and I would urge that once we go through it, maybe there's some data points in the economy section. I think it would be beneficial to get as much of it as possible to the commission so that we can understand. Not sure what kind of feedback they will have, so I think getting them as much as possible would be beneficial, in the long run.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, can
Yes.
Jeff, on the capital budget, because I'm on that committee now, I replaced Joanne on it. Have you seen the narrative that was presented to the select board this spring from capital budget?
Yes, yeah, we're looking at all the existing information, and I think the trick that we're working on is there's so much in the capital improvement plan, and we're trying to figure out the best way to demonstrate that the action items being identified in the LCP either are addressed in the capital improvement plan already or need to be. And there's this dichotomy that works where not every single thing in the capital improvement plan will relate to the LCP. And so we're trying to sift through and make sense of the important things to distill down to the middle, like what's relevant for the LCP.
Absolutely.
What kind of, and I do appreciate what Joanne said about the operational budget. I think giving some kind of nod to it is important because everything that's not capital improvement will potentially fall under some of the operational expenses. And I think maybe reducing the amount of information or the emphasis on it, I think will be important because we get to things like staff support, and that's not a capital improvement item, but it's the best place in the LCP to make mention of it. So we're kind of working through that. Adam and I are working on that this week and next week. So hopefully we should be able to have an updated draft for the 18th.
Great.
Okay, I did like the section, though, where you spent a little bit of time talking about the process, which is a significant improvement over the past several years in terms of how the capital budget is put together. I mean, that was a massive undertaking.
Binders.
And you gave that a fair amount of ink, and I think that was good. I thought that was a good explanation. It shows a really good effort on the part of the town. Anything else on LCP?
I don't think so.
Kath? So I was going to mention.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Jeff,
you.
thank you
Bye.
so much.
Thank you, Adam.
Adam?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for our 2 viewers and 2 participants. And
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
all right, thank you. Spread the word.
Barely hear that.
okay,
Whoa, that was agenda item number 1, Madam Chair.
I know.
Goodness.
Mattakee's update.
Yeah, the MUC committee gave the presentation to the select board last night. I hear it went pretty well. I haven't finished watching all of it. I was not there, but I think it went pretty well, from what I heard from Assistant Town Administrator Bill Scott. So,
Can you remind us, if you can, about where we are in the timeline based on last night being the presentation? Your general sense of it? I'm not holding you to it.
yeah, the general sense of it, I mean, right now, we have the survey out, and that's going through June 30th, and then we're having a workshop to kind of present this on July 15th. And then with all that feedback through the summer is when BSC Group's going to be working on actually starting to do some of the renderings and the laying things out and seeing how.
Based on the
things-
3 options.
Based on what the MUC directs them to do with regard to all of the input that they've received from all the different land use groups. So you may have one where, for example, we're going all in on this sports complex and convention center, and it's taking up the whole site. Otherwise, you might have, we're just going to look at more of a local recreational type facility, and then we'll have some housing over here and those types of things. So, and then one of them has to include some space for this potential school. So they need to figure out what kind of thing. I don't know how that's going to work out. So then they're going to be working on that. The whole goal is to have the 3 finalized, kind of MUC finalized 3 ideas to the select board for January of 2026.
Thank you. That's
Long
really
story
helpful.
short. I should have gone right there.
No, that's helpful to know. So now we can sort of, the reins get dropped a little. Not dropped, but eased.
Yep. I'm going to be.
Can get done.
I'm going to be sending out tomorrow morning a bunch of pushing out the publicity to all my peeps and my email lists and whatever. So you might find that you get something again from something else or whatever. I did send it out already through Civic Plus when I was advertising this meeting, also letting people know about that as well. So
The muck is
all
muck.
good.
Next item on our agenda would be meeting minutes. Kathy set out separately. I know you have to go. Is this yours or mine?
That's yours.
Okay,
Would you give that to Kathy?
thank you. Yeah, that's Kathy.
Yeah, don't you walk away with my
There
pen,
you go.
Susan. She's very good about it. I give her credit.
Meeting minutes for May 21st. May I have a motion?
So moved?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye. But there's
Roll
also
call with
Deirdre.
Deirdre.
Roll
We
call.
have to
Deirdre.
roll call.
Aye.
Oh,
Oh,
Okay, all right, 4-0.
we heard it.
yeah, thank you, Deidre.
Is it Deidre or Deirdre?
Deirdre.
Deirdre.
Thank you.
Deirdre. All right.
No, I just was wondering if I mispronounced it. It's like Naomi and Naomi, I've gotten that.
Yeah, Deirdre.
There's a difference. Yes.
We can do, do we have to do a roll call on that? I don't think we do a roll call on that.
Well, because
For
it's hybrid.
remote?
I think because of the hybrid
Because you're a
factor,
remote
Madam Chair.
participant.
I apologize, okay. I'll remember that the next time. Or my clerk will remind me.
I was ready. I was actually ready, but
Ready.
Kathy beat me to it. Maybe I'm
Any
being.
committee
Maybe I'm
updates?
obsolete. Yes, Madam Chair. Monday, June 2nd, the RAC committee met. The RAC met, excuse me. I think the two most important takeaways were, Town Administrator Rittenhour did say regarding the location and resolution of the pump station affecting Contract 6, which has many domino effects. And I wrote down in my notes, we are moving toward resolution and honing in on a solution with the Select Board, and there is a sense of urgency. And he expects this to be wrapped up this summer, which is great because we do need to get that contract signed, bid, potentially rebid, signed off, approved, so that this work can start in the fall alongside Contract 5. So
Remind me where Contract 6 is.
6 is the pump station across from the new park. It's that section of 28.
Okay.
So it sounds like there's been some nice progress there, and I know there was an executive session last select board meeting about this topic, and so Mr. Rittenhour is able to fill in the rack a little bit more on Monday afternoon. So it feels like there is some progress there, and that is positive news. That doesn't mean that other contracts won't continue to be executed and portions of the work will continue on, but we certainly would like to have Contract 6 alongside Contract 5. Also, lots of progress. I won't bore you with the details at the actual site of the new facility, but everything is hunky-dory. That's what I would say there. Last thing was very interesting. We had a couple of representatives from Mill Pond Village, which is located where Buck Island Road ends at Camp Street, right across. So if you take Buck Island Road all the way to the end, and you come to the end, and you're staring at a development across
yeah.
the street.
Yeah.
That is Mill Pond Village with 61 units, I believe.
Yep.
They actually have their own separate sewer system, or treatment plant.
Yep.
But they came to the RAC and had written a letter and then we had a little back and forth just about, they would like to be in the conversation as future phases are considered. And lots of good reasons for that to happen. And we'll see where that goes. But it was nice, just like we appreciated all of our public committee meetings, participation by the community and not just the nice people that show up every month. And it's good to know that people are taking a more proactive view. And actually, as we continue our conversations, which I think will be much more into the summer, into the fall, about where Phase 2 is actually going to be versus, as I mentioned in previous meetings here, where it shows. I wouldn't say there's going to be humongous differences, but there will be some tweaks based on the watershed permitting, as well as the ability to use the golf course, as well as in reaction to the permit, that we expected to be much larger for the actual facility, which came in at 375,000 gallons, which is not enough. So all those things are continuing, and it is still fascinating. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Will.
Good stuff.
Any other committee updates? Any board member items? I have one. Peter Slovak and I met with the UMass Donahue Institute.
Oh, good.
They interviewed us for around the STR consulting work that they're doing. We basically gave them a background on how we've been involved in STRs over time, kind of the history of how this jumped up. I think they had most of that, but they had given us a list of questions. They wanted to know how the planning board works with other housing committees. They wanted to, some of the questions were pretty straightforward. I mean, do we talk about housing supply? Yeah, we talk about it all the time. We don't talk about short-term rentals all the time, although it does come up. They asked us our opinions about housing supply and affordability, and Peter is, the guy on that, so as a professional appraiser. And the questions we raised to them was, again, trying to understand where they think this connection is between short-term rentals and some assumptions we did ask for information. They make a statement somewhere that short-term rentals have been increasing, and I don't know if that's the case. They have been. So those are the registered ones.
That's the registered
ones, okay. And then I also sent them a follow-up note to check in with the Cape Cod Commission on they're doing a study on short-term rentals as well.
Madam Chair, in relation, just asking a question on it, in relation to what short-term rentals doing to drive the housing price up, is that how that question was asked? Okay.
Yeah, in that vein, yep. So Peter and I, and it was great to have Peter there because he really is the duty expert on that.
Yep.
I thought Peter's question about, are the units that are being used for short-term rentals, what's their price point? Are they not first-time home? Or are they like, the million to $1.5 million? What, is it taking away having a short-term rental? Is it really taking away from that first home buyer?
Yeah, I mean, my information based on my resort hat for a second, which wasn't that many years ago when I was in that industry, the short-term rentals typically aren't the $1 million homes, but they're typically not the first-time home. They are typically within walking distance of some sort of attraction, whether it be the water or some sort of amusement, and they're typically, they're 2, 3, very few 2s, but a lot of 3 and 4 bedroom type homes, because it's all about market rate and where they can drive the most revenue out of it in a very short period of time. They have the same issues that every hotel in Cape Cod has, a 12-week season. So they really, truly need to drive revenue from the short-term rental side. But was just always done to me, in my estimation, is diminish housing stock in the respect to where it's just, driven price, so.
Yeah. We also did mention, both Peter and I did mention, 2 other elements of this. One, that some people do a short, and we've talked about this before, so I'm fully aware of this. They rent out their house for a month, and they go to Nickerson State Park because they need the money.
But those are typically the unregulated ones, the ones that aren't doing it candidly.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I bet they are.
Yeah, I mean, the ones that are doing it as a business, as an investment, those are typically the ones that are doing it right, with the right insurance, regulated through VRBO or Airbnb and all that stuff. It's not, John Jones who's renting his house out for a month to pay his mortgage for the year, while he lives in a tent. That's typically not the person.
No, but we have heard from people that there are some people who do that.
Yeah, yeah.
That's why it's 2 weeks maximum at Nickerson State Park now.
Yeah.
Is it really?
I think it is. I think it is at all state parks. I thought it was.
I wasn't aware of that.
I thought it was to avoid exactly that.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we both mentioned was corporate influence and corporate buys, and how that can be a threat, because we don't know who. It's not a person. It's some big rental company. And Peter had some real real examples of, I forget the name of the company.
Delmar?
Yeah, Delmar.
Yeah.
But he raised that issue, so.
They own quite a few homes on the Cape Delmar.
Yeah.
See their little signs, they'll say.
Yeah.
Kathy, anything from you in terms of further staff updates?
I did get an email from the Cape Cod Commission, and they are working on developing Cape-wide a web page about all of the Cape's outdoor recreational opportunities. I guess they have something similar in Berkshire County through their regional planning. So that, it was kind of interesting, looking at the one in the Berkshires. It was great. It was like, it included things like mini golf and not just our town golf courses, but it would include like private golf courses. So it's outdoor recreation, so it's not the stuff that's happening like Ryan Family Amusement, which is happening inside. It's all about outside recreation. So we're kind of going to work with them a little bit on that. I had sent you guys some information on that Route 6A visioning study that the Cape Cod Commission, they're having a hybrid meeting on June 11th at 6 p.m. and you can find out the information on the Cape Cod Commission calendar. And I provided you guys with the link there. There's a lot of really good information. I did spread this out a little bit to all my peeps up on 6A, on the Historical Commission and Old Kings Highway and you guys. And then
It's the full length of 6A.
it's the full length of 6A. And then I sent it to the communications director to see if she wanted to publicize it some more for people. Because I'm sure we have a lot of things to say because we went through kind of the process already, so that's good.
I can give the very first and last suggestion, which is sidewalks. I know it's easier to say when I'm sitting here, but you can definitely tell it's a different feel, and we talked about the feel of our town when it relates to Route 28. And when you drive on 6A, heading towards Barnstable, and you see people walking their dog or biking or just being
It's different.
out in the community and being active, it's literally driven by the sidewalk or lack thereof. And I know that sounds incredibly simplistic, but
It's not. Yeah.
and I also recognize that it's not that simple to say, well, just sidewalk the whole thing because of all the land takings and easements that could last a lifetime. But it will be a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
That was it.
Okay. Our next meetings are June 18th and the 25th.
With regard to the 18th, it sounds like, are we going to be talking about this draft that went to the commission for the LCP?
That's what I thought he said.
Well, I thought he said he was submitting it, and then they have 3 full weeks, but he wanted to
Right.
submit it
On
by
the 11th.
On the 11th, so that by the time we hit July 4th, they were finishing it,
Yep.
not having July 4th sort of slow it down. But he also, go ahead.
I just don't know what's on the agenda for the 18th.
I think what he
guess
did
is
say
what I-
was, Madam Chair asked for the capital section
okay.
to at least be sent to us electronically, so that if we wanted to discuss it on the 18th, of course, I will defer to the chair as to whether
I don't
we
want to
need
make,
do
I don't
that.
want to make up a meeting, Kathy. If you didn't have anything.
I'll talk to Jeff about it, and we'll go from
You
there.
decide as to whether or not.
Because we are having an extra meeting on the 25th anyway.
Right.
So if we don't need to meet on the 18th, let's not have a meeting for the sake of a meeting.
That's my vote.
Yeah, we've been very busy already with lots of offline stuff, just reading stuff and commenting on it and getting it to Jeff, which is very time consuming.
Madam Chair, could you and Kathy remind us when we're going to be meeting in July? Did we decide that yet? Because
the
our
first
scheduled
and-
meeting is
first and
Wednesday the
third.
2nd,
Yeah,
and I wasn't sure.
yeah, what's scheduled?
Oh, it is?
Yeah, 2 and 16.
Yeah, it's scheduled. It's one of the things, like, if we're not meeting on the 18th, we can maybe try to meet on the 2nd, but if we were meeting on the 18th, maybe we would want to skip the 2nd. But we need to start talking about the zoning, but I want a little bit of time to work on it after the fiscal year is done with all these things. That's my problem. It's like,
June
I keep
30th.
saying in July, but I need to like think about it
No,
and
of
work
course.
on it with people and, coordinate with the attorney and with some of their ideas, to come up with some ideas on how we might be able to address these issues that everyone's kind of happy with, so that when it comes to you, at least it's been a little bit vetted by some other people.
Well, we can certainly
Yeah, we'll
hear about it via email, however you decide to do it.
So I thought there was discussion, Madam Chair, about taking the week of the second would be
Yeah.
the first,
not.
not doing one
That's
that
right.
week, so.
We
Which I,
did talk about that.
Sure, nobody would hate.
It gives me more time to do stuff because I'm not doing minutes or prepping and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I would just say, as someone,
so we might not meet on the 2nd.
Yeah, we'll decide. I'll send an email about the,
We'll just get to the
sorry,
18th.
anybody out there, I don't, on the 18th, and then we'll kind of figure.
We'll focus on the 18th and go from there.
Thank you.
May I have a motion to adjourn?
so moved.
second.
All in favor?
Roll call, Madam Chair.
Roll call. Deirdre?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Rubenstein?
Aye.
Joanne, aye.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.